Chapter 31 Cute Amy. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Amy hung out at the Plummer house most evenings and sometimes in the afternoon as well, but she hadn't been there much the past several days. Suzanne had been keeping her busy at their home, so Suzanne would be able to flirt with and dress sexily for Alan without her daughter getting involved. But Suzanne could only keep Amy away for so long and, indeed, Amy showed up again Sunday night. It seemed that Amy, like her mother, also preferred the happy environment of the Plummer home more than the unhappy one of her own Pestridge house. Mostly that was because Amy was very good friends with Catherine, even though they were 1 year apart in school. Catherine was a junior, while Amy and her brother Brad were both seniors like Alan. In fact, Amy and Catherine were more like close sisters, since they'd been doing things together since they were in diapers. Amy was a truly unique girl. She was one of the most beautiful girls in school, as befitted the daughter of someone with Suzanne's looks. Her breasts were still far from the heaving watermelons that her mother had, but nonetheless they were more developed than almost everyone else's at the high school, even a little bigger than Catherine's. They also looked proportionately bigger because Amy was only 5'8", compared to Catherine at 5'11". It also didn't hurt her bust line that she was slightly plump. That by no means meant fat, she just had a fuller, curvier figure than the typical skinny fashion model. She had mostly copper-colored hair that verged on becoming dirty blonde if she spent a lot of time in the sun. Like both her mother and Susan, she had fair skin and tried to avoid the sun as much as she could. Her face differed from her mother's though. Whereas Suzanne had a naturally sexy, come-hither look and narrow eyes and eyebrows that made her look very intelligent and worldly, Amy had a much more open and innocent look. She had wider, hazel eyes and a nearly permanent smiling expression, with big, rosy cheeks. She almost always seemed happy and content, because she was a naturally positive and happy person. But what made her unusual was the rest of her personality. She was frequently called an airhead or a space cadet. She came across as extremely absent-minded, completely guileless, and naturally kind, leading people to conclude that she was too na.ve and gullible for her own good. Her mother in particular worried about how Amy would survive on her own in a harsh world. As a result, all her family and friends tried to protect her and run interference for her. In reality she just had different interests than her peers. She wanted to be an artist, so she tended to look at things with an artist's eye, noting compositional aspects rather than attributing meaning to what she saw. That would have explained a lot of her airhead or space cadet detachment, except that only her family and very close friends realized that it was her artistic bent that caused her to behave that way, simply because she saw things so differently. Regardless, her personality and looks perfectly fit the role of cheerleader, so naturally she was on the varsity cheerleading squad. She'd become a cheerleader in part because it was what Catherine was doing. They were already best friends, but being on the same squad of 6 cheerleaders only strengthened their bond. Catherine was on the squad because she wanted to be popular, and she was so athletic and good-looking that she could get on the team even though her personality didn't fit in with the other cheerleaders. Amy didn't share those motivations, but wanted to be with her best friend Kat. Like Catherine, it wasn't hard for her to get on the team, thanks largely to her looks. Suzanne had an even harder time understanding her other child, Brad. In recent years, he had moved into a world that was completely alien to his mother and his sister. He'd become a rebellious type, somewhat like the popular image of James Dean or the Fonz. But time had changed what appearances were considered rebellious. Brad had ever-present black clothes, spiky hair and a few piercings. He was into loud thrash metal music that everyone else in the house hated, and he really loved macho men stuff like cars, football, and fishing. He was on the football team at school as well, so he had some areas of common interest with his father. But he and his mother had little to talk about, other than what food was being served for dinner. So with a husband she resented and a son she didn't know, the only reason for Suzanne to be at home was to be with Amy. But Amy was rarely at home, she was often off with her friends, doing cheerleader practice or hanging out in malls and the like. When Amy did come home, she was like her mother in that she preferred to be over at the happier Plummer household next door. She was somewhat close to Susan and Alan, since they'd known her from before she could talk, but both were also on different wavelengths, Susan with her religious prudishness and age difference, and Alan with his nerdy, boyish pursuits. So she usually hung out with Catherine when she went to the Plummer house. Amy and Catherine weren't that naturally compatible, but they had shared everything together from early childhood. That led to Catherine acting like Amy's very protective older sister, even though Catherine was only 11 days older and Amy was a grade ahead in school. Amy seemed so clueless that her family and friends all tried to protect her, especially from leering men. Amy had had a frightening sexual encounter the year before, where the guy had tried to take advantage of her apparent na.feet and rape her during a date. Luckily, he hadn't gotten very far before she'd successfully cried out for help. So other people were always telling her whom she could do what with and when, keeping her on a short leash where her social life was concerned. Therefore, the issue of whether to tell Amy about Alan's medical situation was a difficult one. On the one hand, she came over to the Plummer house a lot, and like her mother she came and went with her own key without knocking. But on the other hand, nobody really knew if she could keep a secret, because they'd never known her to keep an important one before. For all they knew, she might just up and blurt out something in her absent-minded way. Even Suzanne tended to think of Amy as an airhead. The result of all this was a very awkward scene that Sunday evening. Alan, Catherine, Susan, and Suzanne were in the living room watching TV when Amy came over. That in and of itself wasn't unusual, because the Plumbers had a really amazing wide-screen TV. That was another reason why Amy liked to come over so much. But since no one had told Amy about the new, sexing things up, policy, she didn't know why the three women there were dressed in such revealing clothing. Susan wore a formal and somewhat revealing dress, while Catherine wore a loose summer dress. Suzanne was wearing more formal clothes than what she'd just worn at dinner back in her own home. But it was clear to Amy that none of the others were wearing a bra. None of them realized that Amy had entered the house. As she walked into the living room and stood behind Alan, she looked over towards her mother and realized that, from her point of view, or Alan's, she could see her mother's entire pussy. Suzanne was engaged in a bit of a stealth operation. She'd worn a fancy outfit that covered her upper body more than usual, and that even kept her boobs quite restrained, so as to draw Susan's suspicion away from her. But the skirt exposed most of her thighs when she was standing. Not only had she helped Alan come twice in his room earlier in the day, but she'd been teasing and tempting him with her appearance almost all afternoon as well. Thus, by sitting on the sofa with her feet up on the cushions, the fabric rode up to her waist and exposed everything below it. The positioning of the sofas meant that neither Catherine nor Susan could see that Suzanne now had her pussy completely exposed for Alan to see. As if that wasn't enough to blow Alan's mind, her hand was also absent-mindedly lingering in that area. It looked like she was liable to plunge a finger into her slit at any moment. Everyone was looking at the TV in rapt attention, except Alan, who clearly had his eyes on another show. "Hi Mom," Amy finally said, after checking out everyone in the room. The others all looked up, startled, trying to find where the voice was coming from. Suzanne immediately jumped in her seat and began covering her pussy even before she'd figured out who was speaking or from where. When she saw where Amy was standing, she turned beet red. Alan blushed as well, though Amy could only see the back of his head from her point of view. She couldn't be sure of where he'd been looking. "Amy. You surprised me." "How you doin'?" said her mother, scared, but trying to sound nonplussed. "Okay. Whatcha watching?" Friends rerun. Come sit down and join us." Suzanne made a show of making room so that Amy would sit on the same sofa as her, putting her daughter between herself and Alan. Amy did so. A commercial soon came on, and they muted the sound as they usually did for commercial breaks. Amy asked, "Hey guys, where are all the clothes? Everyone's dressed kinda all skimpy." One could hear a pin drop in the ensuing awkwardness. No one knew what to say. The problem was that none of the women had talked about the potential for such a situation with Amy coming up, mainly because Catherine and Susan both looked for Suzanne to take the lead, but Suzanne was in denial about her daughter becoming a sexual creature. Catherine and Susan were going through a sexual awakening, and having Alan around was what made showing off fun. He was a safe target to test out their new looks. He was so polite and considerate that he didn't have it in him to do something shockingly aggressive or non-consensual. Neither woman would even think of wearing the same clothes around a stranger. Suzanne was getting an erotic buzz by taking things one step farther with Alan, and was greatly enjoying the slow hunt since it was rare for any man to not instantly fall all over her. But Catherine and Susan had been such goody-goodies for so long that not even Catherine had fully realized where Suzanne was taking things. She knew in general terms what Suzanne had been doing to Alan in his bedroom, since she was listening in, but she would have been shocked to discover how Suzanne had been secretly exposing her pussy. A painful and extended pause came to an end when Suzanne answered Amy, "It's the heat wave, honey pie." That was Suzanne's usual term of endearment for her daughter. "The air conditioning isn't working over here, so we're all just dying." It was true, the air conditioning was broken, thanks to Suzanne. Taking advantage of a minor heat wave, she wanted the temperature uncomfortably warm, which would encourage the wearing of skimpy outfits. She'd simply thrown a breaker switch on the air conditioner unit, and then told Susan that she'd take care of getting a good repairman she knew to come and fix it. Thanks to that set up, she could come up with all sorts of delays and excuses. "But none of you are wearing bras or panties," Amy pointed out. "That's totally weird." "Cool, but weird." She pouted, "I wish I didn't have to wear undies all the time." The three other women were taken aback again. That they weren't wearing bras was obvious. Even as Susan moved around in her chair to speak to Amy, her giant boobs bounced around and then jiggled in ways that would give any man an instant boner. It didn't give Alan a hard on only because his penis was already rock hard, and had been so almost from the moment he came home that afternoon. But the lack of panties was far less obvious, unless one had seen what Suzanne was doing as Amy walked in. So Susan asked Amy, "How did you know we're not wearing panties?" "I saw Mo." Suzanne assumed that Amy was not going to complete her sentence by saying, "I saw Mom's pussy," and she was playing with it in front of Alan. So, foreseeing what was coming, Suzanne cut her off. "That's right." Suzanne blurted out, masking her true, frightened emotions. "I'm so proud of you. My daughter is so observant, aren't you?" Amy shrugged as if to say, "Heck, anyone could see that." Suzanne continued, "Yes, she is." She looked over to Susan and said to her, "You see, most people looking at you would never guess that you're not wearing panties. But an observant artist like my daughter would be able to notice the absence of panty lines even from a distance." Suzanne pressed on before Amy could contradict her or stupidly blurt out something else that would expose what she'd been showing Alan. She was regretting not having given Amy a heads up as to what was happening, rather than just avoiding the issue and hoping that Amy wouldn't come over. She thought quickly, trying to come up with better excuses. "So it's the heat wave, but that's not the whole story. You see, we made a private bet, didn't we, Susan?" Because Suzanne's head was turned toward Susan, Amy couldn't see Suzanne's face, so Suzanne made wild gesticulations to Susan with her eyebrows and hands to indicate that Susan should go along with what she was saying. Catherine saw the faces and started giggling. Susan was totally surprised. She replied lamely, "Private bet." "Yeah, that's it, a private bet." She wasn't a great actor, since she always wore her emotions on her sleeve, but she tried her best to play along. Suzanne continued to expand on her made-up excuse, "You see, it's been unusually hot lately, and so the other day, we women, we were all sitting here and discussing how hot it was, and trying to figure out what to do about it. We made a bet, and I won. And the terms of my victory were that we'd all use my method to beat the heat by wearing loose clothing and no bras or panties for the whole month. Wow, said Amy. That's really cool, in more ways than one. And I'm really surprised, especially that you'd go along with that, Aunt Susan. I mean, you're so traditional. Susan replied nervously, yeah, well, a bet is a bet, right? And it's not really so bad. In fact, I don't mind at all. I'm a lot more comfortable now. And anyway, it's only for inside the house. Not even your house, of course, just this house. No way would I walk around like this in front of a stranger. That reminded her of standing naked in the shower in front of Alan, and she started to squirm about nervously. Why don't you dress like that at home, Mom? And what about Alan? Asked Amy. He just. Suzanne again cut in before Amy could say any more. Alan is a member of the family, right? So he doesn't count. It doesn't matter if we walk around naked in front of him, even, 'cause he's a very nice respectable boy who would never take advantage of us. Right, sweetie? Right. Alan, somewhat bewildered by the conversation, figured it was best to play along too. Suzanne quickly went on, now, honey pie, you might say, but Mom, you're not a plumber. But you know that you and I are like members of this family. So sweetie is perfectly fine with our plan. Oh really, said Amy with innocent glee. That sounds like fun. I want to do it too. Can I join you guys for the month too? The other women all looked at each other questioningly. There was an unspoken understanding that the decision was really up to Suzanne, since she was Amy's mother. So, grudgingly, Suzanne answered, that's fine, darling. But if you do, you have to promise one thing. From this moment on, you won't say one thing about any of this to anybody. Not a word about panties, or bras, or looking, or nakedness, or anything. Is that clear? Not even talking amongst ourselves. Just total silence on this. We don't talk about it, we just do it. Okay. Amy enthused. I like keeping a secret. This is going to be fun. Suzanne was very proud of herself. In one fell swoop, she'd accomplished 3 things. She'd managed to get Amy to keep quiet about Alan staring at her uncovered pussy, she'd come up with a credible explanation that would cover just about anything Amy might accidentally barge in on during the next month, and she could now test Amy with a less important secret to determine if it would be possible to tell her about Alan's medical treatment sometime in the future. Chapter 32 Naked Amy. You are listening at novelfull.audio. But Suzanne was not expecting what happened next. The others had begun turning back towards the TV, since the commercials had ended and they thought that the excitement was over. But Amy immediately took their words to heart. She undid her bra under her T-shirt and pulled it out and off through her sleeves in that way women sometimes do. Then she grabbed the T-shirt and quickly pulled it over and behind her head, then down her arms, letting it fall to the floor behind her. It wasn't exactly the most logical sequence of events, but everyone was too shocked to pay attention to the details. Suzanne cried out angrily, Amy Pestrich. What the heck are you doing? Stop that. Susan looked over towards Amy and did a double take. Amy. What are you doing? I want to get dressed just like all of you. Didn't you just say that was okay? As Amy talked, she pulled her shorts off, and then reached to take off her panties. Alan was completely enraptured. Amy was the only person in the room he'd allowed himself to have naughty fantasies about before this had all started. With all the recent excitement she'd gotten lost in the shuffle, but now his lust for her came surging back, stronger than ever. Sweet Amy. I've never seen her like this. But, your panties. Susan blurted out to Amy in dismay. Didn't you all say to not talk about it, but just do it? Amy responded. I thought we weren't even supposed to say the word panties. With that, she grabbed her own panties and pulled them down her legs and completely off. In so doing, her boobs bounced all over, much to the delight of Alan and the horror of Susan, Catherine, and Suzanne. Suzanne was the most perturbed, because she still thought of Amy as her little girl, rather than as a teen verging on full-fledged womanhood. But even Suzanne conceded, "That's what we said. Quick, honey pie, put your shirt and shorts back on as fast as you can, and sit back down for the show." She hoped that Amy's getting nude would distract her from asking awkward questions about why her mother had been showing off her own pussy just a short time earlier. But Amy didn't seem to be in any hurry. She stood there in all her naked glory, happy as could be. Alan's heart leapt into his throat as he waited impatiently to see what their reaction would be. Whoa! Amy is sexy. Dang! Instant boner, he said to himself, even though he was already hard from Suzanne showing off her pussy. But she's just standing there in her birthday suit. Are they gonna allow her to stay like that? Okay. Just a sec, said a completely unperturbed Amy, while turning around to grab her shirt. It had fallen to the floor, so she bent down to pick it up, bending stiffly at the waist. That put her big, wide but on perfect display for Alan, and allowed him to see her pussy lips peeking between her legs as well, as she didn't keep her legs closed. Alan was so excited that he almost impulsively scrambled over the arm of his chair to get closer to Amy. She turned around again and put on the shirt, and then finally the shorts. He felt really bummed when the shorts eventually covered her bush and the surprise striptease finally ended. Wow, I've never seen a completely naked woman in my life, and then I see two in just a few days. And Mom and Ames, of all people. Amy exuberantly hurried over to the sofa and sat next to her mother. Then she said to Susan, "You're right, Aunt Susan, it is fun to dress like this. Thanks, everyone, for letting me play too. Doing it in front of Alan makes it even more fun, I think. Thanks a lot." She flashed a big smile in Alan's direction. You're welcome," he said. Suzanne looked at Alan and rolled her eyes in amusement, trying to non-verbally communicate her thoughts to him. "You're welcome, my ass. As if you suffered a lot." He thought to himself, "I can't believe how surreal things have gotten around here lately." But it still wasn't over. He looked over at Suzanne and Amy, both sitting on the solid sofa that was built for two or even three. The others finally turned back to the TV, allowing him to notice that in the position he was in, he still had a good view of Suzanne's pussy, though he could only see a bit of it and not the massive, lewd display of her entire crotch that she'd been giving him only a few minutes earlier. But right next to her sat Amy in shorts about as shorts can be. She sat with one leg propped up on the sofa, allowing him to see some of her pussy too. The snatches of mother and daughter being accidentally, or maybe not so accidentally, displayed right next to each other got him turned on all over again. He waited a few excruciating minutes until "Friends" was finally over, and then hightailed it back to his room. He promptly jacked off. Then he did it again. Back in the living room, after Amy and Catherine left, Susan wanted to have a word with Suzanne. Susan's worries were getting the best of her, especially when she remembered the shower incident. "Suzanne, I appreciate what you're trying to do for Tiger, but don't you think it's gone too far? Shouldn't we call this off, this crazy, sexing things up idea?" Suzanne said, "You're concerned about what happened with Amy." "Yes, but not only that. At least she's not related to him, and you're not either. But what about my daughter and me? How can I forgive myself before God for all of these sinful acts? At some point I have to put my foot down and say, no more craziness. When I think about some of the things I've been thinking and dreaming lately." She shuddered. What if our innocent angel starts feeling the same way? Or Amy? I can't allow that. I see. Suzanne was at a bit of a loss on how to get Susan to continue with her scheme. She decided a limited, tactical retreat was best. "Susan, I think you're right. It would be good to tone things down just a bit. But certainly not stop. Look what's happened to Sweetie lately. He was so down last week, he dragged himself around like a slug. And now, have you ever seen him happier? I don't know if happy is the right word, Susan pointed out. Let's say walking on air then. That was a more accurate description. So was bewildered, or stunned, but Suzanne tactfully refrained from going there. She continued, in any case, it's done him a world of good already. Sweetie's energy problem is still there, whether we like it or not. We have to deal with it. But now with his confidence surging, I'm sure it'll be just a matter of days before he asks someone out at school. It was a blatant lie. Susan looked at her skeptically. Suzanne said more honestly, until that happens, what's the problem? It's doing all of us a world of good. You're finally breaking out of your conservative shell and loosening up a little. I never thought I'd see the day. So is Angel. Do you know how much the other girls at school have snickered at her for the old-fashioned way she was dressing? But she takes after you completely. She adores you. So with you coming to terms with your own body and starting to dress like a normal person, so is she. You can't stop that now, if only for her good. But what feels good isn't always good in the eyes of the Lord, Susan said sanctimoniously. Suzanne rolled her eyes with disdain. Susan, there's nothing in the Bible about nudity being a sin. Where in the Bible does it say that you wearing the black cocktail dress that your tiger loved so much is a sin? Don't you want to make him happy and help him out at the same time? Susan was very doubtful, but she was too ashamed to reveal her deeply concealed worry that she was becoming sexually attracted to her own son. And she was no match in arguing with the silver-tongued Suzanne. I guess. If you say so. Suzanne didn't stop there, but kept arguing her point of view for a long time. By the time she was done with Susan that evening, Susan was convinced it was her moral duty and even her responsibility to walk around the house half naked to help Alan out. Suzanne was a great and dear friend to Susan, but she almost always got her way in the rare times when she really wanted something. Back in his room, Alan was happy to stay there for the rest of the evening, doing little more than alternating between masturbating and homework. But about an hour after he'd retired to his room, his sister knocked on the door and asked to come in. Alan was a bit perturbed, since he was naked under the sheets and in the middle of masturbating yet again. Doing it 6 times a day really did take up a lot of his time. In addition, he figured the smell of his cum had to be at least somewhat obvious. But he didn't have an excuse to turn her away, so he grabbed a book from his bedside and said, yeah, I was just lying in bed reading. Come on in. Catherine came in wearing a revealing yellow dress that he'd never seen before. I just bought some new clothes today, and I wanted to show them just to you. Can I get your opinion? What do you think? She leaned up against a wall and struck a sexy pose for him. It looks great on you. No kidding. What a totally new look you've got. I like. He wasn't just saying that either. The strapless dress was so tight it looked like it was painted on. She would never have worn anything like it even a few days earlier, even just inside the house. She beamed. Thanks. You're too kind. But I've got a favor to ask. Can you help me out with something in my room? He was concerned by the fact that he was naked under the sheets and sporting a big hard dot on to boot. Sure. Give me just a minute. He hoped she'd leave and give him a chance to put on some clothes. He noticed too that she was sniffing the air curiously. Guessing that he was naked under the sheets, aside from his T-shirt, she suddenly rushed towards his bed, acting playful. Just a minute. Come on, lazy bones. I need help now. She started tugging at the bed sheets, while he frantically grabbed hold of them so she couldn't pull them off. They had a frenetic tug of war with the bed sheets, but for Alan it was no game. He had to keep them on or face grave embarrassment. Unfortunately for him, he was winning in keeping the sheets on, but in so doing he was unable to simultaneously hide his raging hard dot on. The sheets tented up over his crotch after he moved his hands away. Her eyes grew wide, then her hands stopped tugging on the sheets. "Oh my! What do we have here?" She giggled profusely as she stared at the tented sheets. "Hey, it's not funny," said a hurt and shamed Alan. "What is that thing in there?" she asked, pointing right at the bulge. "Did they move the Eiffel Tower under your sheets, or are you just happy to see me?" She giggled some more. "Haha," he said without laughing. He tried to act annoyed, but he was more aroused than anything. Part of him didn't really mind getting caught. "All right. Sorry about that, bro. Never mind about the help, and have fun doing your thing. You sure are hiding something big under there though. I wonder what it could be." She blew him a kiss and left the room. By the time he went to sleep that night, he realized that he'd come 8 times over the course of the entire day, including twice before he got out of bed that morning. He'd been so excited by Susan, Suzanne, Amy, and Catherine that he'd wanted to do nothing but masturbate all day. Furthermore, he thought, now I've got so many new and different erotic memories that I'll be a walking hard-on for a long time to come. Not to mention the fact that tomorrow looks to be an even more promising day. I can't even imagine what all 4 of them are going to wear. Sweetness. Chapter 33 Dear Diary, you are listening at novelfull.audio. To Alan's disappointment, the next day was surprisingly boring. For one thing, the weekend was over and he had to go back to school. In the past he'd always enjoyed school and actually looked forward to going, but lately it had become a chore. It seemed like wasted time that took away from his increasingly exciting time at home. But he slogged through it nevertheless. Back at home, all the women seemed a bit taken aback by the incident with Amy the night before, so they dressed and acted more conservatively. Amy also spent most of the afternoon and evening at the Plummer house. That frustrated both Alan and Suzanne, because Suzanne couldn't find an opportunity to get away alone with Alan for more of their supposed internet porn viewing. Suzanne had intended to take Alan's seduction a step further, giving him a handjob. She didn't terribly mind the prospect of getting caught in the act by Susan or Catherine. She could claim that she just got a little enthusiastic in helping Alan out with his problem. She was confident that she could smooth over any resulting ruffled feathers with either of them. However, Amy hadn't been told of Alan's diagnosis and prescribed medical treatment, because Suzanne was still attempting to protect her daughter from all things sexual. That left Alan having to take care of himself all 6 times that day. Each time he spent it fantasizing mostly about Suzanne. Only days earlier he hadn't permitted himself to consciously think of his Aunt Susie in a sexual way, even though he'd sometimes broken that resolve in the middle of pleasuring himself. But now he was masturbating to the overt idea of fucking her silly and having great orgasms while doing so. "Yeah, I call her Aunt Susie, but she's not related to me. Of course it would be completely wrong to have sex with her, so it will never happen, but just to fantasize about it is completely harmless. Fantasies are just fantasies, and this one works for me. The more I think about her, the less I'll have dangerous thoughts about sis and mom." So those ideas about Suzanne were pretty exciting and not very troubling for him at that point. He was a bit slow on the uptake on sexual matters, so he still couldn't really believe that Suzanne might want to fuck him as well, which would make his fantasies become real. He thought that she just loved to flirt and tease, and enjoyed helping him do his thing. Both those things were true, but they didn't tell the full story, which was that she had an audacious plan to seduce the entire Plummer family if she could. All in all, Alan was still a happy camper with such exciting and intense sexual fantasies. But he was sure that Tuesday would be much better. The reason wasn't simply because he figured that Suzanne would find a way to come into his room again and help him with his orgasms. What was even more exciting, if that were even possible, was the fact that he and Susan had another appointment with Nurse Akami after school. Akami had called a few days earlier and said that Dr. Fredrickson had given her permission to take over most aspects of his case, as it was something she was particularly interested in and it tied in with her career plans in medicine, provided that the Plumbers were okay with that, and of course they were. She'd said that she wanted to get started immediately in familiarizing herself with the case, and that she thought that bi-monthly appointments would be better, but there would be no extra cost. So that, and a lot of other related thoughts, got Alan hard every time he thought about her, which was often. His main problem was that he had another day of school to go through, and it wouldn't do to be sporting a raging boner everywhere he went. Not to mention the fact that he couldn't concentrate at all in his classes anymore. That night when Catherine wrote in her diary, she was in a contemplative mood. Dear diary, sometimes I wonder why I love my brother. Wait, scratch that. It's easy to answer why I love him. He's a great guy, and he totally loves me. The question is, why am I in love with him? But I don't really see what the difference is. If I love him, and he's handsome, my age, and male, how could I not be in love with him too? I hear there's some kind of biological thing that dampens that kind of feeling for kids in the same family, but that's never been the case with me. Maybe it's because we aren't related genetically. Diary, you know better than anyone that I've been madly crushing on him for years. Be nov calm God, I love him so much. I know I've made lists and tried to quantify it in different ways, but the thing is, whenever I see him, I just fly. I fly. I swear, I get totally moony. Sometimes it's so tough just being normal around him, especially when I want to kiss his sweet lips so hard. And that's only all the time. Of course I know he's a doofus, and a goof, but he's my doofus. I even love his flaws and quirks. The main thing is, we're best buds. Pals. He's not only my brother, he's my very best friend, even more than Amy. I can't imagine not living with him. That would just kill me. I mean, I seriously can't even imagine it. He's like my rock, someone I can completely trust. And he's so dreamy. Such a hunk. And he's well hung too. He's the full package, so to speak. My life has had this bittersweet edge these past few years, knowing how much I'm in love with him, yet feeling that it could never be. Even if he did feel the same way, what about Mom? I could never break her heart and have her find out her 2 kids were committing incest with each other. She's so much more than just a mom, she's like 2 parents in one. I could never, ever hurt her. But now. Oh my God, it's all so exciting. Who knows what could happen now, with this medical treatment craziness. Aunt Susie is so great. It's like she's breaking down the door, and I can rush in that newly opened door, right behind her. I wouldn't mind sharing bro with her, if it comes to that. Better to have half of his heart than none at all, right? I totally wish I could talk to her and find out what she's planning and where this is all going, but I'm afraid I might ruin everything with that approach. Right now, these are the most thrilling, best days of my life. I've got to play it cool and roll with the punches. I totally want to just throw myself at bro and fuck him silly, but I can't. Not yet, at least. Patience. Chapter 34 My Teacher. Ms. Gloria Reimer, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Susan and Suzanne continued their usual morning workout tradition on Tuesday morning. However, Suzanne had added an exciting new component. Before, after, or sometimes even during their exercise session, they would talk about their sexual dreams from the night before, as well as detail any arousing experiences during the previous day that the other might have missed. Susan was generally very honest in her accounts, although sometimes there were dreams or parts of dreams that she was just too embarrassed about to tell. And she also tried not to reveal just how much she was thinking about her son in a sexual way lately, or how passionate her feelings were. Still, very little got past Suzanne. Susan's heart was like an open book, and she was a terrible liar. If she tried to hide something, Suzanne usually was able to ask pointed questions and coax the true story out of her. Suzanne was less honest. She also explained her dreams, but only very selected sections. She knew that most of her dreams were far too shocking for Susan to handle at this stage. She even had dreams that were just of her and Susan intimately loving each other for hours. To even hint at those kinds of feelings could have ruined their friendship altogether. When Suzanne did talk about her dreams, she described things in an extremely arousing way that inevitably left Susan hot and bothered. At times, she tried to similarly describe what she and Alan were doing when Susan wasn't around, but Susan didn't want to hear it. So, once in a while, Suzanne resorted to telling it like it was a dream, only to finish with, "Come to think of it, that wasn't a dream. That was what happened last Friday when we were up in his room. That little trick worked every time." Suzanne could actually see Susan's arousal level immediately double just by the look on her face. The only problem was Suzanne usually had a hard time keeping a straight face. Susan felt that Suzanne helping to inspire Alan was a necessary evil, but the more she heard about it, the more she felt that she'd be tempted to help him in the exact same way, which she was trying her best to avoid. She found that her resolve and resistance were slipping with each passing day. Looming ahead was the next medical appointment she and Alan had at Dr. Fredrickson's office, on Tuesday afternoon. Given what had happened during the last appointment, just thinking about the next one sent shivers of excitement up and down her spine. Hours later, Alan sat in his fourth period class, World History. Soon it would be lunch. He was excited about the upcoming doctor's appointment, but not as much as Susan was, since he had a lot of other things on his mind too. That was especially true in this class, his favorite class of the day. Novcom, his teacher, Ms. Gloria Reimer, was not just the object of his longest crush, but she was an excellent teacher too. She was talking about something the class found interesting, but Alan didn't hear a word. He was thinking about all of his recent luck. He looked around the classroom and thought, it seems there's a large number of ordinary or even ugly people all around me. Seniors in high school are in the prime of life, and Southern California is justly world-famous for its beautiful women, but even here the percentage of really attractive people remotely comparable to the beauties back home is small. Of course there are a few pretty girls here and there, but none of them are as beautiful as Christine. Man, I haven't been thinking about Christine really at all lately, have I? I suppose that's no surprise, given the other women occupying all my fantasies these days instead. However, when he did think of Christine, his heart filled with pain. He wondered how he'd ever overcome his shame and be able to talk to her again. He'd been avoiding her, even when she tried to reach out and repair their friendship. The burn of rejection was still too hurtful for him. While Christine was stunningly beautiful and outrageously curvy, Gloria Reimer was a knockout in a more subtle way. Alan had been pining after her for a long time. He'd grown quite adept at imagining her teaching class naked, and was doing it once again. The school year had just started only a few weeks earlier, at the beginning of September, but he'd known Ms. Reimer a lot longer than that. She'd taught his American government class during his freshman year, during her very first year of teaching. Then, after a year without a class from her, she'd taught his U.S. history class his junior year. Now, as a senior, this was the third time in 4 years that he was taking one of her classes. In fact, he realized that he was her teacher's pet, as he was for 1 or 2 other teachers. As one of the smartest and most emotionally mature students in the school, his being a teacher's pet wasn't too surprising. But he found it awkward at times to be the teacher's pet for someone on whom he had an intense crush. Besides, he had an extra special friendship with her, and it had been that way since his first year in high school. They just seemed to click as friends in a way that transcended their difference in age and social status. Alan didn't know her exact age, but he knew she was in her late 20s. She seemed even younger though. It was well known, for instance, that she was a frequent surfer at the nearby beaches. As a result, many students frequently called her "surfer girl," though no students called her that to her face. Her love of surfing was also a good indicator of her athleticism and physical beauty. Her boobs were fairly big for a surfer. She wore a 34C bra. However, few women could match the high standards that Alan had when it came to breasts, which were based on the generous boobs of his mother Susan and his Aunt Suzanne. Even so, when she stood in a bathing suit, Gloria Reimer, who was known to her friends as Glory, was definitely impressive. A number of times, beginning 3 years before, Alan had seen Surfer Girl at the beach with her surfboard, and that was exactly when his masturbatory fantasies of her had begun. She looked absolutely perfect with a surfboard under her arm, like a woman from a Playboy spread of sexy athletes. She was firm and muscular all over, but the muscle didn't take away from her femininity and she still had nice, smooth curves. Her curly blonde hair waved in the breeze, making a nice contrast to her tanned skin. She was of medium height, about 5'7", a good deal shorter than the nearly 0.6 tall beauties in the Plummer and Pestridge households. Back in class, it was much harder to see her beauty. She almost always wore conservative clothes that covered up all but her hands and face. Her hair was short as well. It wasn't that she was prudish, but she just didn't want her body to become a distraction in the classroom or an issue with her colleagues. As a result, she went to great lengths to cover it up. But she had been seen by many others at the beach, and was clearly the object of many young men's fantasies, as well as those of a few young women, no doubt. When Alan and his friends went to the beach, they all talked openly about the possibility of further Surfer Girl sightings, and which beach to go to in order to see her. Since she surfed on many different beaches, usually distant ones, probably in part to foil the admiring students, running into her was a matter of pure luck. When class finally ended, she discreetly motioned with her hand that Alan should speak to her once the classroom had emptied. She was a very kind and friendly teacher, and knew many students on a personal level. That meant knowing something about their private lives and talking with them socially in school. In most high schools, to see a teacher outside of school was an unstated taboo that rarely happened between any student and teacher, but she wasn't deterred by that. However, of all her students in the fourth period, only Alan would have frequent talks with her after the class had ended. Since lunch followed the fourth period class, Alan would usually stay and talk for 5 minutes or so and just have fun gabbing, and then make his way to lunch. Sometimes they would even spend all of the lunch period talking, a practice that they probably would have done more frequently except for the disapproval of the other teachers. The subject would often be her class or the students within it. He would give feedback about things like whether people were getting bored or what material in particular went over well, so she could improve her teaching technique. She would also expand on historical facts mentioned in class that he'd found interesting. However, the two also couldn't resist engaging in gossip about the other students. It wasn't just Alan telling her the gossip he knew either, in fact, it usually was the other way around. He was surprised at how many things she knew about his fellow students that he didn't. She had her own gossip network which included other teachers, and he wasn't nearly as interested in school gossip as she was. If he did inquire about what others were doing, it was usually only a lead to telling her something new. However, this time she didn't want to talk about any of those things. Instead, she asked him, "Is something up, Alan? The last few days you've been kind of spaced out, and today you were on another planet altogether. I think if I would have, I dunno, torn off my dress or something, you wouldn't have noticed at all. What gives? Oh man. What am I going to tell her? She's too perceptive and she knows me too well to believe some bullshit story." They sat directly on the edge of her desk, as they usually did when they talked after class. He shifted around nervously in front of her. To be honest. He scratched the top of his scalp nervously, and hung his head down sheepishly. It's women trouble. I'm thinking about women too much. Oh really? Asked a suddenly very interested teacher. Someone in class? Or is it someone in school? Christine, perhaps. Like many people, she knew all about Alan's crush on Christine. She was not only an insatiable gossip hound but was also very observant and a good guesser. Actually, it's not really even someone in this school, per se. Oh, really? She thought, this is getting more and more interesting. And what does that, per se, mean? But I can't tell you the details, he added. You see, it has something to do with an embarrassing medical condition that I've got. Young man. She liked to call him that. You've got me really confused now. Could you please clarify your meaning? I don't want to pry into your personal affairs. Bull honky, he thought. She continued relentlessly, but it looks to be something that's affecting your behavior in class, so I want to know. She always had good excuses for learning more gossip. I really can't say. She stared at him witheringly. All right, I can say this much, if you promise not to tell a soul. I promise. She made the "cross my heart and hope to die" gesture over her chest. I have a medical condition which is causing me to make some adjustments in my lifestyle, and that's making me really confused. I wish I could say more, 'cause I'd really like your advice about some things, but I can't. I promised my family that I wouldn't tell a single person about this medical thing. Can you please understand that and respect it? Yes, I suppose, but that really doesn't explain anything. For one thing, young man, you're a perfectly healthy, young man. There's absolutely nothing wrong with you that I can see. For another, that explanation seemingly has nothing to do with girl trouble, which is what you said is distracting you in the first place. That's true, but I really can't say any more. Well, okay. I guess I can say this. Energy. My problem is a lack of energy. I sleep too much, and I'm always tired. You know that. You've bugged me how many times about nodding off in class. So I'm getting treated for that. It's not really a big medical problem. Nothing to get worried about. If the treatments work, then great, if they don't, then I'm the same as before, which is no big deal. Okay, does that explain enough? I really have to go to lunch now. Yes, thanks for sharing that with me. I really appreciate your confiding in me. I'm glad we're friends enough to have this conversation, and I promise I won't tell anyone. You know I'm a gossip, but I also know when to keep my mouth shut, so don't worry about that at all. But I still don't see the connection between that and your girl trouble. He looked away in embarrassment. Like I said, it's complicated. She put a hand on his shoulder, which was highly unusual for her. Even though they had been close friends for over 3 years now, there were limitations to their friendship since she was a teacher and he was a student. For one, she didn't feel comfortable seeing him outside of school without some education-based justification such as a museum trip. For another, they almost never had any physical contact, in part for fear of fanning the flames of suspicion by people who already thought it likely that they were being too friendly with each other. She said, "This doesn't have anything to do with your asking Christine out and her turning you down, does it?" He blanched. Oh, geez. You know about that. How do you know that? She let go of his shoulder, and shrugged. You know me, I'm a gossip hound. Oh man. That sucks. If you know about that, it means other people do too. Man. He sighed. He added, but it doesn't have anything to do with that. Well, not directly, anyway. Like I said, it's complicated. She frowned with frustration. Well, I hope you'll be able to clarify this mystery for me before too long. I just hope that whatever your medical problem is, and whatever your girl troubles are, it won't affect your behavior in this class next week. We have some important tests coming up. If you want to talk about it some more in confidence, don't hesitate to come to me. Thanks a lot. I'll do that. She added, you know I pass on a lot of gossip, but I can keep a secret. Especially if it's about you, I would never tell a soul. She almost added, because you're special to me, but that was the kind of thing a teacher wasn't supposed to say to a student, especially when she knew that student had a crush on her. He nodded. Gotta run. He was out the door in a flash. She continued to sit on her desk, trying to figure out just what the hell he was talking about. Lack of energy, huh? Tired. Seems like he's suddenly thinking about girls a lot, or maybe too much. Perhaps he's taking some pills to boost his energy that are having the side effect of boosting his libido. That would explain things. Yesterday and today I noticed him coming into class like he had a tree trunk stuck between his legs. Definitely an uncontrollable, raging hard on. I'm thinking he must have been actually highly aroused for the entire class today. It's really unusual for any guy to be that aroused for that long. I wonder if he was thinking of me at all. Perhaps he's in a state of constant horniness. Glory was attracted to Alan. But not only was she his teacher, she also had a serious boyfriend, so she dismissed her feelings for Alan as harmless and never to be acted upon. She did flirt with him a bit, but so very subtly that he didn't even notice. For instance, her comments a few moments earlier about tearing her dress off had seemed to go completely over his head. She was only 27, and constantly felt as if she would rather be one of the other students instead of the teacher, with all the unfortunate social walls that came with that role. If I were also a high school senior, she mused, I would be all over the idea of Alan as my boyfriend. But I'm not, and I would never dream of actually having an affair with a student. No way, Jose. Unfortunately, Garth has been a real jerk lately, he's hardly acting like a boyfriend at all. Especially in bed. He's left me stuck with all this fantasizing. The idea that the goody in polite Alan could actually be a horny monster in a constant state of arousal will definitely be food for thought, and my fingers get busy in my pussy tonight. After all, fantasies are harmless, right? Chapter 35 Another Visit to the Doctor, Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After the school day came to an end, Alan and Susan finally found themselves sitting in the doctor's waiting room, waiting for Nurse Akami. Alan was extremely relieved that the wait would soon be over. He'd been so horny all day long thinking about Akami that he could hardly stand it. He had a very good feeling that something sexually exciting would happen. Since Akami had massaged his penis last time, odds were she would do it again. For the first time ever, he seriously considered masturbating in a school bathroom during lunch because his need was so great, but the fear of getting caught by other guys had stopped him. A big part of Suzanne's scheme to seduce Alan was getting Susan to loosen up so that Suzanne could have a sexual relationship with him without ruining her relationship with her very best friend. As a result, after Suzanne had spoken with Dr. Fredrickson on the phone and found out that Akami would be handling the next appointment by herself, she called up Akami and subtly encouraged her to get Susan to loosen up. Suzanne had previously had some brief interactions with Akami, but she still had to turn on the charm to get Akami to go along. Akami had already been thinking along those lines. While waiting for Susan and Alan to arrive, she thought, Mrs. Plummer was obviously raised very conservatively. She trusts me implicitly because I'm a medical professional. I doubt she'll stop me no matter what I do, as long as I have some kind of excuse. So if I push her, one of two things will happen. 1. She'll get increasingly horny as I grow increasingly bold with Alan. And that'll be fun, to watch such a prim and proper woman nearly bursting with lust. Or 2, she'll freak out to the point that she won't want to come back. That's even better, 'cause it would mean I can have these appointments just with Alan. Then I can really have my way with him. I'll be able to tease him, jerk him off, and, hopefully soon, fuck him on every visit. And as a delicious irony, I'll even get paid to do it, and Wilt will have to go along with it. Either way it's win-win for me, and for Alan too, as long as I keep up the pretense of medical necessity. However, I can almost guarantee the second outcome won't happen. I know Susan's type. She's one of those Bible thumpers who are raised to obey their parents and preacher without question. People like that always obey their doctors without question too. I'd have to do something really outrageous to get her to think twice about not trusting me. But then again, I am planning on doing something really outrageous. Suzanne Pestridge will be tickled pink, I'm sure. Akami appeared at the door to the waiting room. To Alan, it seemed almost as if she was posing as she stood in the doorway, showing off her fine body. Whether that was the case or not, her sultry appearance got him even more excited. "Nurse Fubuki will see you now," she said with a wry smile, making a joke of the fact that she would effectively be both Alan's doctor and his nurse. The two of them went back to the same room they'd used the previous time, and soon Alan and Susan were chatting with Akami about this and that. Akami confirmed that, for all intents and purposes, she would be taking charge of Alan's case. That was fine with Alan and Susan. Nurse practitioners often managed treatment programs once they'd been prescribed. This time though, as soon as they got down to business, Akami matter-of-factly told Alan, "Please take off all your clothes and put on that gown. You might as well do it here since I'm going to see all of you today in any case." He didn't mind undressing in front of her, but he felt very self-conscious about doing so in front of his mother. He made sure to take his clothes off with his back turned to Susan. Susan watched his tight butt wiggling around with great interest. She was also secretly delighted to discover that the gown didn't cover much at all. Akami took a look at his full erection as he was changing and joked, "Looks like we won't have to worry about getting you in an erect state this week." Susan also noticed his erection. She sucked in her breath and her heart started to pound wildly. "Oh my goodness. It's practically as big as it is in all my dreams. Tiger is such a big boy. I can't wait to watch Akami stroke it. I wonder if she's going to give it another abnormality check." But he lost the erection a few minutes later when Akami put on some latex gloves and poked him with a needle so she could take a blood sample. She also took a number of other cursory measurements. In actuality, the only thing she really needed for medical purposes, and for the entire appointment, was the blood sample. Her other measurements were just to make the rest of the appointment appear more necessary and legitimate. Finally she got to what everyone, including Susan, was waiting for. "Ah," she said, "now it's time to check your penis again. I hope you don't mind, Alan or Susan, but we'll have to perform another check for abnormalities." Both mother and son had strongly suspected that this would be coming. Susan was intensely conflicted about it, wanting to see and yet not wanting to see at the same time. In truth, she'd been looking forward to this moment for days. Suzanne says that nudity is no sin, and that should be some consolation, but she doesn't know just how impure my thoughts are. Why, just watching Tiger's cute little tush, my nipples got as hard as they can get. I'm going to keep my eyes closed, no matter what. Akami put on one glove in a grudging attempt to maintain some plausibility that this was a medical procedure. But what surprised everyone was that no sooner had Akami placed one hand on Alan's stiffness to rub it, and the other hand on it to check for abnormalities, than he started coming. Akami was sitting close to Alan when the cum began flying at her. Strings of cum hit her first on the face, then the chest, and then further down as she futilely tried to back away. Most of it ended up on her face, but a bit was deposited on her legs and the floor. Some of it even landed right in her open mouth. "Sorry. So sorry. I'm so very sorry." He apologized far too loudly. He was totally mortified and ashamed. The fact was, he was very sexually inexperienced and therefore didn't have much control over his orgasms or forewarning when they were imminent. The anticipation of having another abnormality check had been too much for him to take. "I didn't expect that. Please forgive me," he nearly screamed. Susan also looked mortified, as if she were dying of shame that her son had done such a vile thing. But at the same time, she practically swooned upon seeing Akami's face thoroughly splattered with her son's cum. Her pussy and nipples throbbed with arousal as she unconsciously licked her lips, imagining she was licking up all that cum. Akami, however, got over her initial shock quickly and took it in stride. "Look, you two," she said. "Don't worry, it's nothing." She began taking off her uniform. "Remember, we all want Alan to orgasm as many times a day as possible. 6 times a day, or more. If he can ejaculate while in the office today, so much the better. Am I right? In fact, if he can ejaculate more before this session is over, that will help to make this a successful appointment." My only disappointment is that we weren't ready with a cup, because we have to take a sperm sample again before you go. Chapter 36 Another Visit to the Doctor. Part 2 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Akami used a sink on a counter behind her to wash the sweet-smelling semen off her face. With her back turned, she gathered and swallowed all the tasty cum near her lips that she could reach with her tongue. That's really tasty. Then she took off most of her clothes. She finally turned towards them, standing in just her underwear. Both mother and son were more than a little shocked at her new appearance. Alan privately thought to himself, she's every bit as beautiful as I hoped. Her boobs were more impressive than her stifling, conservative nurse's uniform had made them out to be, and she was very fit and shapely. Akami lied, sorry I had to take those off after he got them, messy. But don't worry, I'll have the doctor bring in another uniform for me before we're done. In actual fact, she didn't want the doctor to come in and spoil the mood. She hoped they'd soon forget about her expecting a change of clothes. Her cum-soaked uniform was now sitting in a heap on the counter with the sink. She said, let's make lemonade out of lemons. In fact, if by just wearing less clothing I can help Alan reach orgasm again, that will also be for the better. Don't you agree? He just nodded. It seemed like a lot of people were asking him such obvious questions these days, like, is it okay for me to take my clothes off? He never knew how to respond in those situations, because he feared that too much enthusiasm might scare the person off. Susan seemed somewhat mollified, since Akami didn't seem to mind. Akami again held Alan's penis. She knew that, after such a powerful orgasm, it would take some time for it to re-engorge to full size, despite her more revealing appearance. As she resumed stroking his penis, she made some idle talk to help pass the time. Alan, can I ask you how you're so tanned all over, even underneath your underwear? I don't know. I guess I'm just naturally dark. The adoption agency wouldn't let us know my parents' true names, but the racial background was given, and there is some Middle Eastern blood in there along with French. Ah yes. The adoption. Sorry, but I forgot that Susan isn't your natural mother. You two look similar, except for a few things like your darker skin. This line of thinking reminded Akami of something she wanted to bring up. Alan, I want to talk to you about exercise in relation to your condition. Susan and Alan each immediately became concerned but remained quietly attentive. The nurse continued, you should avoid certain types of exercise. Tell me, do you know the difference between aerobic and anaerobic exercise? He answered, sure. Aerobic is like cardio and toning types. Anaerobic is strength training and muscle building. Correct. Akami smiled approvingly. A person with your condition should avoid or severely limit anaerobic exercise. Your body currently is unable to properly produce the muscle fibers which that type of exercise develops. Susan interrupted. Alan is on his school tennis team. Does that mean he should quit? And what about swimming? No, that's aerobic exercise, which is very good for him right now. Exercise that builds agility and endurance, while also raising his heart rate and blood pressure, will have a significant positive effect on his condition. Akami felt she could be a little playful, so she added, that would also include most forms of sexual intercourse. Once Alan is able to find a girlfriend to help him out, we may see an even greater improvement in his condition. That news both comforted and horrified Susan. My tiger is nowhere close to finding a girlfriend. If he does. Does that mean? Should I allow? My goodness. What are the options there? She fought mightily against that train of thought, trying instead to concentrate on Akami's next words. At that point the nurse stated, I'll write him a note for school that should keep him out of anaerobic exercise programs. Akami had continued to stroke Alan's penis throughout the conversation. He remained semi-flaccid, primarily because he was so aware of being jacked off in an examination room in front of his mother, a situation which made him more nervous than excited. After a few more minutes of fruitless stroking, Akami said, "Since we're short on time, I think I need to take additional measures." She got up again and put some lotion onto her finger. Then, after sitting in front of Alan again, and having him scoot forward to the edge of the examination table, she took her gloved hand and brought it up towards him. "Alan, if you'll please lean back a little," she said. "Thanks. Now don't be alarmed, but I'm going to stick a finger up your anus." "What?" he asked in horror. "Why? This will help with the stiffness of your penis. Don't worry. A little bit of stimulation of the prostate can be very pleasurable and increase arousal. Of course it's necessary to first lubricate the finger, but no doubt you're aware of that already, Susan." As a matter of fact, Susan had never heard of such a thing, but she didn't doubt a medical professional. Akami slowly inserted her finger into Alan's anus. "How does that feel?" he grimaced. "Strange. Really strange. But I guess it's not a bad feeling. Just hang on. It gets better." She slid her finger in a bit further, then slowly began moving it back and forth and in and out. At the same time, she fondled his penis and balls, trying to revive him from his flaccid condition. Susan watched with rapt attention. She felt like she couldn't breathe, while her heart continued to hammer. She found herself hoping that Akami's efforts would bring about his swift revival. But at the same time, she felt guilty and dirty for looking, so she lifted her hands to cover her eyes. "How's that?" Akami asked after another minute had passed. "Wow. Really weird. But better." He thought, "Man, that feels fantastic. Does this make me gay or something? Up the butt. It's so gross. Who would have figured? And my naked butt wriggling on this exam table is kind of turning me on more too." Akami spoke in an aside to Susan, "So, as you can see, the finger in the anus has made the critical difference. He's re-erecting." She continued to work her gloved finger in his anus, while her other hand worked his engorging dick. Susan stared in disbelief. Her vow to keep her eyes closed had been a miserable failure so far, since she was staring between her fingers. However, she could at least console herself that Alan didn't realize where she was staring since he wasn't looking in her direction. She didn't know why exactly, but it took all her willpower not to grasp her boobs with both hands. Getting no answer from Susan, Akami continued talking. "That reminds me," she said in a casual tone, as if rubbing someone's erection after they had just come all over one's body was a perfectly normal part of one's nursing duties, "I haven't yet asked the most important question of all. Alan, how are you doing on maintaining the proper number of daily stimulations?" "Unfortunately, not so good," he said bashfully. He tried to keep his head down and not stare at the nurse, but that only made him look down to where she was rubbing his shaft. His other options were to look towards his mother or at a blank wall, so he closed his eyes instead. He confessed, "The first week or so I was right on track. But then the next 6 days after that, I didn't have any orgasms at all. But in the last week or so I've been working on it, trying to catch up. Yesterday was only 6, but the day before that I actually had 8 orgasms." Susan already knew that fact, as she'd been keeping a close eye on the daily progress chart that Alan kept on the inside of his door. But she found herself gasping with surprise anyway. In her current state of arousal, she instantly pictured him jacking off over and over, with his cum repeatedly squirting into the air. That made her heart beat even faster than before. Her panties were starting to get moist. She hated that she couldn't control her response. Akami, on the other hand, was poker-faced. That's not good. I hope the doctor stressed last time that it's not just the overall average. Consistency is important too. You can't go without doing it 1 week, and then do twice as much the next. Some slight daily variation is fine. For instance, you may find yourself in a situation where you can't find privacy at all for a day, and so you only come once or twice. But to go without for 6 days is very troubling. You may have wasted the entire 2-week period. I'm really sorry, he said. But this was a very special circumstance. You see, I asked a girl out who I really liked, and she said no, so that really took away all my motivation. But I'm over that now, and I feel confident that kind of thing won't happen in the future. Susan held her breath, wondering if he was going to mention the visual stimulation help he'd been getting at home. She exhaled with relief when she realized she wasn't going to be implicated in helping him. Well, that's good to hear at least, said the nurse. But if we're going to salvage the week, it would help greatly if you could reach orgasm a large number of times today. This is really an emergency situation, to rescue your lost week. Just now, that was how many times today already? Akami had been stroking Alan's erection continuously during this discussion, keeping him as hard as marble. She'd been slowing down or stopping as necessary to keep him on edge without letting him ejaculate. She'd finished stimulating his prostate long before, then removed her gloved finger from his anus and discarded her gloves. That was my third, he replied, recalling the 2 times he'd masturbated in bed before school. Good. Now, why don't you close your eyes and keep them that way so you can concentrate on what I'm doing? She said that so Susan would be free to stare at Alan's hard on. Then she spoke to Susan, but she made sure to stare at the penis that was less than a foot in front of her face, so that the horny mother would feel even more free to stare at her son's privates, believing that she could do so without detection. Susan, Alan seems to be a good patient who is taking his responsibilities seriously. How do you see the situation? Are you comfortable with things, and the nature of his admittedly very unusual treatment? Susan dropped her hands from her face. Well, frankly doctor, nurse, she stammered, I'm having some trouble adjusting. Everyone at home has had to cope with the new situation, and we're all finding some aspects of it very trying. What aspects would those be, Mrs. Plummer? Akami hadn't even started the abnormality check, she was just blatantly jacking him off. No one seemed to mind though. Susan decided that to reveal her true feelings wouldn't be very prudent. She wished to say, I've shocked myself that I'm walking around without a bra or panties every day now, and I don't care. I feel really good when I see Tiger looking at my body. Sometimes I feel like a hussy and just want to throw off all my clothes and stand before him in the altogether. I just can't stop thinking about my handsome son or his big member. Instead, as she stared at Akami's hand sliding up and down Alan's pre-cum soaked shaft, she said, there are many troubling aspects. For one thing, we're all having the difficulty of telling some people, or maybe not telling them. We don't want this to be widely known, but we also have trouble keeping this secret from close friends. I see, said Akami, while also intently watching her handjob. Her expert hands were already bringing Alan close to orgasm again. She now had him where she could gauge if he was getting too close, and back off as necessary, keeping him in a state of near constant bliss. That's only natural. Might I inquire whom you've told? That's all right. So far, just Catherine, my daughter, and Suzanne, my close friend and next-door neighbor, whom you may recall meeting briefly at the end of our last appointment. She's almost like family. We haven't told my husband yet, because he's out of touch, overseas. It sounds like you're being very selective in whom you tell. That's very wise. I was afraid you would hire a professional to assist Alan. That's a dangerous roll of the dice. You never know what will happen there. I agree completely. Now Susan was finally conversing about something that she was more comfortable discussing, at least as comfortable as she could be, considering that she was sitting right next to the nearly naked Akami staring at Alan's erection being jacked off while they talked. But for some reason it felt far less strange to her than she could ever have imagined when his treatment had started 3 weeks earlier. She felt too good at the moment to think about all the reasons why this might be morally wrong, if not outright sinful. Her attitude towards masturbation had changed completely in recent days, at least in regard to Alan's need to do so. She still thought of masturbation as a sin, but Suzanne had convinced her that an exception could be made on the grounds of medical necessity. Now every time Alan reached orgasm, it felt like a small victory to her, like the baseball team one is rooting for scoring another run. And she judged each day as a success or failure partially based on whether he reached orgasm 6 times or not. She, and Suzanne and Catherine, now frequently found excuses to go into Alan's room so they could keep an eye on the chart on which Alan recorded the number of times that day that he had climaxed. Still, it was unnerving watching him actually getting stroked, not to mention her having seen Akami fingerfucking his anus. Her nipples ached to be touched, her entire body tingled with desire. Her fingers desperately wanted to take over from Akami's, but her conscience told her that would be wrong. The nurse asked her, so, since there's no professional help, and he failed to get anyone to go out with him, does that mean that all of his gratification is self-gratification? I'm afraid so, Susan responded sadly. She thought again about the sin of Onan, the Old Testament story against masturbation. Akami said, I will repeat what the doctor said last time. It is much more preferable if he can get help for at least 3 of the 6 times a day, on average. So much self-gratification can be extremely taxing for his penis, he may end up rubbing it raw. This was something Dr. Fredrickson had coached her to repeat, to assist the unfolding of Suzanne's scheme. He may, for instance, have lengthy periods where he is unable to achieve orgasm because his penis is so sore. Has that occurred already, Alan? No, fortunately not, he replied. He still had his eyes closed, both out of sheer embarrassment and because Akami had requested it. He had no idea that Susan was staring with avid attention at every last little move Akami's fingers were making up and down his shaft. He just assumed that his mother was so prudish that she'd be looking anywhere but there. Akami continued for Susan's benefit, although without looking her way, that's good to hear, but it's just a matter of time, perhaps days, or at most weeks, before he has that kind of problem. So please redouble your effort to find someone to fulfill that role. I understand completely. We'll do our best, Susan replied resolutely. Akami's hand slid up and down, up and down, up and down. I hope you do. There are many medical problems where a helping hand, so to speak, is completely necessary. That's why so many people have personal nurses or live in an assisted living situation. The unusual nature of his treatment doesn't reduce the fact that he needs assistance. One way or another, we'll find someone to help him before our next appointment with you, Susan promised. That's the spirit. Akami enthused. Chapter 37 Do This at Home. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Akami continued, now, if you will turn your attention back to Alan's penis. Susan's eyes had never left it. You'll see that it is once again completely erect. It had been for quite a few minutes already. So I'm going to begin to check for abnormalities. Since it's such an extremely large and thick penis, this check will take a lot longer than usual. Susan asked, is it really all that big, or are you just saying that? Akami said, here, let me whisper something in your ear, because I don't want Alan to get a big head. Then, running her fingers all over his mushroomy cockhead, she joked, although I'm afraid it's too late for that. Susan scooted her chair forward and leaned in, which put her in much closer proximity to her son's boner. Now she could easily notice the scent of his strangely sweet-smelling cum. Akami whispered, oh yes, it's very big indeed. You obviously have an extremely virile and well-endowed son. His erection is bigger than 99% of them. She just made that up. She doubted that it was true, though she figured Alan would be in at least the top few percent. She was using such words to excite Susan, which gave Akami a big kick from watching the prudish woman respond. Just look at it, I can barely get my hand around it. This is a special boy with a special endowment. I'll bet his sperm are as potent as 100-proof rum. Susan sat back in her chair, thoroughly wowed and increasingly wet. Her heart swelled with pride to hear how special her son was. Akami motioned for her to lean forward again, closer to her stroking hand. Susan, I want you to watch closely again so you can become expert and do this at home once a week. Now, the first thing. Susan cut in. Just a minute, nurse. Sorry to interrupt, but did you say, do this at home? Me. I really don't feel comfortable doing anything that would involve touching. You know. His penis. Yes, his, penis. She shuddered while saying such a lewd word out loud. I just don't feel comfortable about that. I'm really sorry. Akami considered her plan to push Susan out of her comfort zone, both to help Suzanne's scheme and just because it was fun to do. It was mostly the latter, since she didn't feel any real obligation to Suzanne. So, Akami responded as if irritated, look, we really need your hands. On help here. If not you, then who? I'm sorry, but as Alan pointed out, it's not like you're his biological mother. One needs to visually examine the penis closely from all sides since he can't do that himself. It sounds like his father is overseas too much to assist here, and I'm sure Alan would prefer a female to help him with this delicate task anyway. So who else does that leave? If you're uncomfortable with the idea, it might just be best if he comes in here once a week so I can perform such checks. Perhaps I could convince my friend Suzanne, suggested Susan. We could have her come in, and you could show her the procedure. It can't be that hard to learn. Perhaps, said Akami, hiding her disappointment. Even though she was supposed to be helping Suzanne seduce Alan, she loved the naughty thought of Susan having to do it or, failing that, getting to do it more often herself. Ask her and let me know. I don't care who does it so long as someone does. This should be done every, let's say, Tuesday, since that's today. And then I would like to perform a check myself during our appointments, which I believe will be every other Friday. That much, said Susan. She was really surprised, as was Alan, since it didn't actually seem to be that grave a medical problem, all things considered. Akami nodded as she kept on stroking. She figured that if she couldn't help Alan every week, she could at least say they needed an appointment every other week. Susan's eyes were glued to Akami's pumping hands. She wanted so badly for those to be her own hands, but she also thought about sin and hell. She suggested, if Suzanne can't do it, perhaps we could pay you to do it all those times. That's another idea, Akami said with greater enthusiasm. That would be a lot of fun for her if it worked out that way. But regarding your friend Suzanne, how is her eyesight? She was looking for excuses to get Suzanne out of the picture, at least as far as these checks were concerned. Perfectly fine, replied Susan. Alan piped up. That's not true. A couple of days ago, she was showing me stuff on my computer, and she said she had eyesight problems. He didn't realize that was just a white lie that Suzanne had used as an excuse to lean forward into a more tempting pose. What, said Susan in honest surprise. That's news to me. I've never seen her wear any glasses other than sunglasses in my entire life. I'll have to ask her about that. Well, that's what she said. He shrugged. Just the other day, in fact. Maybe her eyesight is failing her a little bit lately. That made Akami very happy, because it gave her the excuse she was looking for. Why don't you ask her then? But if she does have eyesight problems, then I'm afraid that it rules her out. You really have to get your head close and examine his skin for any little bump, mole, or anomaly. She leaned her head in. Susan obligingly leaned her head in too, until her face and Akami's were so close they were both breathing on his dick. Akami asked, I assume your vision is fine, Susan. With your prescription glasses on, of course. Yes, it's fine, said Susan dejectedly. Maybe Suzanne can get glasses too. Well, until she gets her vision problem corrected, you'll be the only one at home capable of doing these weekly checks, unless you want me to do them. Susan sighed in defeat. Goodness. I know I've said I'd do anything to help my tiger, but that means I'm going to be stroking his, member. I suppose Akami wouldn't understand if I tried to explain about the sinfulness, the sheer impropriety. Alan was thinking, Jesus H. Christ. If those two don't stop breathing all over my dick, I'm gonna explode. Mom's the worst. Her mouth is so close to my most sensitive spot that if she blows air on it one more time, I'm gonna blow. He gritted his teeth and tried to hang on. Akami could see the tortured look on Alan's face, so she pulled back a few inches, causing Susan to do the same. She said to the busty, panting mother, "All right. With all this talking, I'm afraid that I haven't made any progress in explaining to you the proper procedure here. Let's start again from the beginning, shall we? At least my constant stimulation of his big erection is serving one purpose. Achieving an orgasm is helpful, but it's even more important to have prolonged stimulation first. The real goal should be prolonged stimulation followed by orgasm, to make sure that a hormonal change will be achieved." Susan nodded, trying to pay better attention to Akami and not just gawk at her stroking. But she was so giddy with lust that it was hard for her to think. However, one issue came to her mind. Nurse, may I ask you a question?" "Please do." Susan whispered, hoping against hope that Alan wouldn't hear her talk about this embarrassing topic. "Lately, sometimes, I've noticed. Wet spots on Alan's sheets. I think he's been having wet dreams." Blowing away Susan's effort to be discreet, Akami asked Alan in her usual voice, Have you been having wet dreams?" He bashfully replied, yeah. He added to himself, and they started immediately after our last appointment. "Some of them involve you, but most of them involve Mom." Susan gave up her futile attempt to whisper. She unthinkingly licked her lips as she watched pre.cum dribble out of her son's pisshole. Anyway, my question is. Do wet dreams count as far as Alan's daily target goes? Akami considered that. Her first instinct was to say, yes, since a wet dream was still a valid ejaculatory orgasm. But she remembered Suzanne's purpose for this scheme, and having them count didn't help further that scheme. So she replied, unfortunately, not really. Look at my hand. She hardly needed to say that, since Susan was already staring at Akami's sliding fingers. However, Susan used that as an excuse to lean in closer. The sexual, masculine smell was almost more than she could take. She was so horny that her head was reeling. Akami explained as she slowly stroked, in order for it to count, you need a lot of this. She paused, and slid her fingers from base to tip and back again, 3 times over. She finally continued, a lot of prolonged stimulation, like I said. With a wet dream, there's just no telling what happened or how long it lasted. It's not like you crawled naked into your son's bed in the middle of the night and slid your fingers up and down his thick shaft and maybe even kissed and licked it to make sure that the stimulation was sufficiently intense and prolonged. Right. So I'm going to have to say, no. Susan thought it wasn't possible for her to be more aroused, but she was wrong, because Akami's words made her pussy tingle and gush more than ever before. Oh my goodness. Dear Lord. What if I were to actually do that? Oh dear. That's just too naughty. And, maybe even kissed and licked it. Oh my. The nurse's words didn't go unheard by Alan. He moaned and groaned lustily as he imagined waking up only to find his naked bombshell mother secretly jacking him off. He was slowly losing control. Akami continued, again, we have to recall the example of stimulating the nipples to start the process of lactation. Alan, the ejaculation achieved when you came into the office might not have counted for one of your daily 6, I'm afraid, because it happened so quickly. He was very disappointed to hear that. That meant his record day of 8 times earlier in the week hadn't actually counted as a full 8 times, since he'd come within minutes on more than one occasion. Akami added, what we really need is a long, hard, constant massage of Alan's long, hard erection. Blowjobs are good. That's putting his thick shaft in your mouth and sucking on it with your lips. Susan gasped in dismay at the very idea. But she also was intrigued and aroused. Is that? Could I do that? It's just so big. I'd be happy just to have my hands on it, and kiss it and lick it a little, just like she suggested. Akami continued, but it depends on how you do it. Even a quick blowjob, or quick and nasty intercourse. A fuck and run, as some call it, is unlikely to achieve. Akami had to stop speaking because once again Alan had begun to come furiously all over the place. She'd been carefully doling out her caresses, and she'd pulled back from blowing air on him. But she'd forgotten to take into account the additional effect of her words on the trigger-happy teen, so her sexy talk had suddenly caused him to lose all control. As before, his throbbing erection began squirting his seed all over the beautiful nurse. He cried out, "UNGH. Ugh. Aya." Both Akami and Susan had their faces less than a foot from the tip of his dick, but Akami was directly in front of him, so most of it landed on her. His twitching cock even splattered a little bit on his mother's face too, but only a few stray gobs. Akami reflexively moved backwards and took the rest all over her chest. She used her hand that was still around the base of his hard on to discreetly direct his aim, making sure that it got enough on her bra so that she'd have to take that off as well. "Oh dear," Akami said. She started laughing. "This is getting to be ridiculous, isn't it?" Both Alan and Susan started laughing too. They were both greatly embarrassed again, but not nearly so much as the first time. Laughter helped relieve their nervous tension. Akami leaned in again towards Alan, took off her bra, and said seductively, "Are you trying to get me naked one piece of clothing at a time?" Everyone laughed again, if a little stiltedly. By this point Susan was so aroused that she not only didn't mind Akami baring her chest, she wished there was some excuse for her to bare her own chest as well. Alan was also incredibly turned on. He loved the sight of his jism all over the nurse. Taking off the bra really only served to make Akami look that much sexier, as there were still plenty of cum gobs dripping down her chest. She just remained quiet, looking at him, but he couldn't read the meaning of her expression. In any case, she didn't appear to mind the cum that was spattered all over her face and chest. She just sat there for a few moments, letting the cum gobs drip down. "My God, this is great," he thought. "Is that what they call a facial? I've read about those, but to see it, with him come all over her. Wow. Whatever it is, I love it." Susan's big boobs were heaving up and down so much that it seemed as if she wasn't wearing a bra either. She thought, "My goodness. So much cum. It just looks. It looks so hot. Oh God, is that hot? It's like he's marking her with his precious seed. Oh dear." She had a sudden vision of her own face and bare bosom being covered just like Akami's, which caused such a powerful erotic rush that she nearly swooned. Then she smelled the air, getting such a potent combination of odors of Alan's cum and her own and Akami's pussy juices that she did swoon, practically falling out of her chair. Akami turned to look at Susan to see how she had fared. She couldn't help but smirk a little bit at how obviously Susan was drowning in lust. She pointed a finger to a spot under her right eye. "You have some right there." Susan was so out of it that she wasn't paying attention, which meant that she didn't wipe her face clean. She was in a daze, staring at Akami's cummy face and chest. So much cum, she thought. Is this normal? Is my son unusually potent? Then she remembered Akami's words about Alan's penis being in the top 1%. Her whole body tingled with delight. He is. What a special boy. Akami got up to clean herself off again. Both Alan and Susan watched her go to the sink wearing nothing but a pair of panties. Susan finally put her hand up to the spot on her face where Akami had pointed, not because of Akami's comment but because she felt something wet dripping there. She felt a gob of her son's soft, gooey cum. She looked over at him and was relieved to see he hadn't noticed. Not surprisingly, he was busy watching Akami wipe the cum off her face and chest. Seeing that he was totally ignoring her for the moment, Susan swept the cum off her face with 2 fingers, then placed those fingers under her nose. Smells good. Surprisingly sweet. Not like Ron's at all. She had never had semen anywhere near her face before, as that was improper and disgusting, but she had also heard that cum was bitter and had wondered if it would smell bad as well. She looked up again and confirmed that Alan still wasn't watching. She put one of her fingers in her mouth and licked off his cum. Tastes good too. Really good. Tangy and sweet. Then she thought, what the heck am I doing? This is gross. And so wrong. Can I have a towel? Susan loudly asked Akami. Certainly, replied Akami. She grabbed a towel and brought it to Susan. The nurse didn't seem troubled to be walking about in nothing but panties. However, there was a large wet spot on them over her pussy, so she walked back to her chair quickly, hoping the others would be less likely to notice her aroused condition after she sat down. After sitting down, she rubbed a wet cloth all over her face and chest to get rid of any gobs of Alan's cum that might remain. Alan found the whole scene incredibly sexy, especially as she was cleaning herself while sitting between his legs only a foot or 2 away. He discovered to his surprise that his penis was already hard again. But his hard-on, finally, was also extremely sore. He figured that it would hurt if Akami tried to touch it again. Akami looked at Susan and asked, "Did I get it all?" That forced Susan to closely examine Akami's breasts and face as she looked for stray gobs of cum. She certainly is a beautiful woman, Susan thought. Her nipples are hard, too, just like mine. Tiger must be getting her aroused too. Yes, you're fine, Susan finally said. Susan thought she could feel just how erect her own nipples were, but she reached up and cupped one of her breasts as unobtrusively as she could, just to confirm it anyway. That can't be. There must be some kind of mistake. My own son is making my body do crazy things, forbidden things. I have to be strong. It's like I'm in Satan's den, with all these sinful temptations around me. She was trying to maintain the fiction that this examination was having no sexual effect on her whatsoever, but it was becoming a completely untenable lie. Chapter 38 Breast Examination for Susan. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Akami was ready to continue. She told Susan, "Let's return our attention to Alan's penis. Unfortunately, once again we failed to use a cup to get his sperm sample, so he'll need to ejaculate again before he leaves. Sorry about that, Alan. My bad. Before we forget again, Susan, could you go back to the cabinet there? Yeah, that's the one. Open that and get the sample cup right. There. That's good. Thanks a lot." While Susan was walking and Alan's eyes were following her, Akami quickly reached between her own legs and used her towel to blot her dripping pussy as best she could. Susan soon came back, holding the cup in her hand. She looked at it and frowned. What kind of sinfulness and naughtiness will I be subjected to next? I just have to remember this is all so my tiger can get well. Alan said, "Nurse, I really don't think I can do this again, even though I am, erect. It's just that I'm starting to feel really sore. I've been doing this so much lately." His dick was up but flagging, and only the fact that Akami was sitting topless in front of him kept it from subsiding altogether. "That's the kind of chafing I was warning you both about," the nurse replied. "Unfortunately, we have no choice, we have to get that sperm sample before you leave. This will be a good experience for you, to be sore the first time right in the doctor's office. That way we can determine exactly how sensitive you are. Clearly you aren't going to be able to achieve orgasm on your own this time, so I'll have to assist again." That sounded as reasonable as anything he'd heard lately, which admittedly was all pretty bizarre. "Oh, and by the way," Akami added as an aside, "if you're going to have the prolonged stimulation which this treatment requires, you're going to have to learn to control yourself better." I suggest you go online and look up something called the pubicoccygeal muscle or PC muscle. That's the muscle that can hold back an orgasm. There are some exercises you can do to control it better, so start doing those immediately, every day, as often as you can. Okay. Yes. The PC muscle. Alan had no idea what she was talking about, and his brain was fogged with lust, so he thought of the PC on his desk at home so that the association would let him remember the term. Speaking to Susan again, Akami said, "We can see that his big erection is beginning to subside. So we should act quickly before we lose it altogether." She reached out with one hand and began massaging his dick again. When it became apparent that her stroking was maintaining his penis only at about 3/4 mast, Akami said, "It looks like this may not be enough, so if this happens during one of your manual examinations, Susan, I suggest using further measures. Stimulating the anus is a good one. Or you could try playing with his balls. Baring your chest would be another option. Saying some sexy sweet nothings is yet another. But why don't we wait a few minutes for him to revive? Alan, I bet you could use a break." He nodded in agreement. Susan also nodded, even though Akami wasn't speaking to her, because she badly needed a break as well. Her entire body was pulsing with arousal, and her panties were soaked. Because Alan had splattered his cum all over twice, the entire room was permeated with the smell of his seed. To Susan it was like an intoxicating drug. She longed to get away from it and get her senses back, but it would have been rude to just rush out of the room. After a pause, Akami continued, "On a different note and while we're waiting, Susan, in our last meeting I mentioned periodic self-examinations for breast cancer. Do you check yourself periodically?" Sorry nurse, but I've never done that," Susan said very shyly. "Never. My word, Susan. You could be in danger. Do you realize that your age of 30.7 is nearly the most important time to detect the onset of breast cancer? 1 in 3 women in the US will get it at some point in their lives. Do you even know how to conduct such an exam?" "I don't know that either," Susan said, feeling even more embarrassed. "By all means then, I'd better show you how while we wait for Alan to revive. Take off your blouse and bra and let's get started right away." Akami thought to herself, this'll either scare her off from ever coming back, so it'll just be Alan and me, or I can have more fun with her and get my hands on her huge knockers. Either way, it's a win for me. And breasts that big can't be called breasts, they're knockers. Susan was in complete shock. What? Here? Now? In front of Alan? Sure. After all, I'm already topless. Besides, I'm sure it's not like he hasn't seen you naked at some point or another. In actual fact he had not, except a few days before in the shower, and his view of her boobs at that time had been brief and partly blocked by her hands and arms. In any event, you've probably noticed that he's been keeping his eyes closed, except for these last few minutes. "Alan, can you close your eyes again?" "Yeah," he said as he gasped for breath. Just the idea of having his mother completely expose her huge jugs was making his dick hard again and causing him to tremble with excitement. But Susan for once wasn't paying attention to his tool. She looked up in fear as Akami expectantly waved a stethoscope above her chest. Akami spoke up again to forestall any more protests. "Alan, thanks. Susan, if you're feeling nervous, why don't you keep your eyes closed too? That seems to help reduce a person's sense of embarrassment sometimes, and you only need to listen and feel what I do to pick up the technique on how to do a breast check properly." "Okay," Susan replied, realizing she'd been defeated again. She would never have agreed, except that she was unbelievably horny. She asked feebly, "Are you really sure this is necessary?" She squeezed her eyes tightly shut even before she began taking off her blouse. "I guess Tiger saw me naked the other day, so what's the difference now?" Susan was so embarrassed to have Alan see her naked that she wouldn't open her eyes for anything. So she just opened her blouse the bare minimum that Akami would need, undid the front clasp of her bra, and pulled the cups off to the sides of her breasts where they hung under her arms. "You have a very healthy set of breasts," Akami said, as she began poking at the soft, naked flesh with her stethoscope. That instrument and her panties were all the nurse had on. "But such large breasts are in even more danger of breast cancer. I'm really surprised that no one has taught you about how to examine them." The cold stethoscope continued to poke all over Susan's tits while Akami gave a lengthy sermon on the importance of breast self-exams, the dangers of breast cancer, and just about every other relevant topic she could think of that would prolong Susan's experience. She still hoped this would either cause Susan to erupt into a lusty frenzy or give up altogether on attending the appointments. Akami paid particular attention to exploring Susan's nipples with the cold, metal tool. She found herself getting unexpectedly aroused by the temptingly soft, large tits. She thought back to some lesbian experiences she'd had when she was in college, which led her to an even higher state of arousal. Alan meanwhile couldn't help but peek through slitted eyes. When he finally did, he discovered that Susan's eyes were shut extremely tightly and Akami's back was turned to him, so there was no reason not to peek again. And then again. Soon he was gaping openly. Susan had kept her chest so bound up and covered all these years that he had a hard time registering just how gargantuan her breasts really were. He wasn't touching his erection at the moment, but it was so hard that he felt he could break rocks with it. Despite his best attempts not to think of his mother as a sex object, he'd secretly longed for years to have a good view of her bare chest, and now that dream was coming true. The view he'd had ogling her in the shower didn't come close to this. Susan actually was more relieved than anything to have her chest bared, once she got a little used to it. Seeing her son's shaft stroked repeatedly had filled her with the urge to rip her shirt open. Breaking free of the confines of her bra made her sigh contentedly, like slipping into a cool pool of water on a scorching hot day. As Akami poked and probed with the stethoscope, Susan fantasized that it was Alan's fingers on her instead. "Oh Tiger. Help Mommy. Mommy's so hot. She needs your hands, not this cold steel probe. Touch me, son. Mommy's so naughty. She needs to be touched, and punished. Oh yes, she needs a big, fat, thick punishment. You should make her hold it and stroke it. That'll teach her." As if Susan wasn't already horny enough from the tactile sensations on and around her extremely sensitive nipples, Akami said with seeming clinical detachment, "Now, when we're done here in a minute, I want to teach you some of the best ways to stimulate your son's penis. Remember, it's not just about him coming 6 times each day, it's also about prolonging each orgasm. Who knows, you may find yourself stroking his big erection for half an hour or more at a time. There are all kinds of tricks you can learn to make him feel really good while you do that." Susan felt like she was drowning in lust. Akami's words were the best news she'd ever heard. Yes. Yes. Stroke Tiger's big fat dick for hours and hours. So good. So hot. Akami spoke for several minutes about the importance of prolonging Alan's erections and the handjob methods that could help with that, all the while probing and prodding Susan's nipples with the stethoscope. Susan was so hot, she felt like she would spontaneously combust. And her heat wasn't just metaphorical. She was sweating all over. Just when Susan thought the breast exam was about done and she could get a chance to cool down, Akami said, "But of course the techniques I've been explaining shouldn't be done with a stethoscope. It's extremely important to use one's fingers to discover polyps. If you'll allow me to demonstrate." Akami began groping Susan's tits all over, using both hands. Susan was already extremely hot, wet and horny just from looking at Alan's erection being stroked for so long. The feel of hands on her chest was too much to take. Oh no. Now it really is like Tiger's hands are all over me. I love it. But I have to be strong and resist or I'm going to climax right here and now. What'll Akami think? Such a naughty mommy, coming so hard, dreaming of her son's big sticky endowment sliding through her fingers. She slumped in her chair and involuntarily began wiggling and shaking her body. She was short of breath, and her tits heaved up and down like a ship tossed about in a heavy typhoon. Alan couldn't believe what he was seeing. He longed to stroke his raging boner, but he didn't for fear that Susan would open her eyes and see him doing so. As the breast exam went on, Susan began to feel more erotically charged than she'd ever felt before in her life. Sex with her husband couldn't compare. It was all she could do to maintain some respectability and not moan loudly or scream as she thought about the fact that Alan was sitting just a few feet away and possibly, even probably, looking at her. However, she couldn't bear to open her eyes to find out for sure. She slumped lower and lower in her seat, like she was turning to goo and melting down to the floor. As Akami probed Susan's chest, she thought to herself, God, I can't believe this horny bitch is letting me do this. This is the most fun I've had in years. And she's so damn innocent that she actually thinks this is a valid medical procedure. Ha! Just look at these nipples. I have to figure out a way so I can suck them. That might just be a little too obvious right now, though. And the idea of her being so obviously aroused by her son's cock, that's getting me even hotter. I love it. I've been kind of half hoping to scare her off so I could have Alan all to myself next time, and we can really get wild. But playing with them both is more fun, I think. Several times, Akami leaned forward and rubbed her more modest boobs, accidentally, against Susan's titans. The tips of her nipples lightly brushed against the base of Susan's mounds. Susan was so far gone by that point that Akami doubted she even noticed. Alan, though, most certainly did. He squirmed nervously in his chair, well aware that his erection was standing straight up, completely exposed and bobbing in the open air. He still fought with all his might not to jack off. It wasn't that he had superhuman willpower, it was more his fear of getting caught. Finally Akami could see no reasonable excuse to prolong things further, and she wanted to get back to toying with Alan's penis, so she ended the exam. She concluded, so that's all there is to it, Susan. Many women do that when they're in the shower. It's really no big deal, so please tell me you'll perform these exams regularly. No, don't worry, I'll do my best, Susan said nervously, still recovering and shaking with excitement. She felt like her tits were literally on fire. She'd been brought tantalizingly close to a great climax, and her whole body still buzzed and tingled, yearning to be pushed over the edge into ecstasy. How often do these checks need to be performed again, she asked, since she was too horny and preoccupied to have been paying much attention to what Akami had said earlier. Mostly, she was wondering how often she'd have an excuse to play with her breasts from now on. Once a month is pretty common. But a well-endowed woman such as you might want to do it more often. It's really impossible to do it too much, the only problem is not doing it at all. Thank you, nurse. I'll remember that. Susan opened her eyes and looked back at Alan. She was relieved to see that his eyes were closed, but she didn't realize that he'd only closed them moments earlier, just as the breast cancer check appeared to be ending. She also noticed that his penis was rock hard again, so she kept her eyes fastened on it. She was aware that she'd dripped a copious amount of wetness from her vagina. The front of her panties was soaked through and she was now actually sitting in a little wet spot. But she hoped that things would calm down and she'd be able to get out of the room without anyone noticing her leakage problem. Chapter 39 Susan's First Handjob. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Akami finally turned back to Alan, spied his turgid erection, and said, well. Would you look at that? Looks like we've lucked out and can continue with Alan's treatment, Bedo.m. Of course, Akami had performed the breast exam in front of Alan knowing full well that the sight of such an impressive pair of knockers being probed would make any male hard, even if, or especially if, the knockers in question were his own mother's. Akami put a finger back into Alan's anus and resumed caressing his meaty rod at the same time. Addressing Susan, she said, while I'm busy here, why don't you practice the breast exam techniques I just taught you so you'll be sure not to forget them? What? Here. Now, was all Susan could stutter out. She was nearly speechless watching Akami's hands stroking again. She didn't know if she wanted to scream out for her to have mercy and stop, or shove her aside and take over. Why not? Otherwise, you're just going to sit there staring at me rubbing Alan's big penis. Who knows how long I could end up doing that? I'm sure you must be tired of that sight already. Susan was almost too flustered to answer. What? Yeah. Of course. Tired. Alan's big penis. Big member, I mean. Member. I'll just go ahead then. Akami, seeing that Susan seemed submissive to her suggestions, tried to push her luck a little more, to see just what she could get away with. She said, "You'd better take your blouse all the way off, just to be sure." Susan nodded and removed her blouse and bra from where they still hung on her shoulders. She had no clue why she had to get completely topless, just to be sure, but Akami was right about Susan naturally following authority figures. Since the nurse suggested it, Susan assumed there had to be a good reason for it. Alan thought, "Oh man. Friggin' kill me now. This is how I want to die, staring at mom's fucking awesome rack. No way. And while Akami is jacking me off, no less. This is heaven." Susan began fondling her boobs with both hands. But at the same time she was too transfixed to take her eyes off her son's lengthy tool. A part of her really was trying to obey the instructions and perform a proper breast check. But because she hadn't been paying attention to Akami's breast check earlier, she had only a vague notion of what to do. However, she didn't want to admit how she'd been completely spaced out. She only knew that there was something about checking for bumps, and that if the motions of Akami's hands had been anything to go by, it was extremely important to check the nipples extensively by pulling and twisting them in every direction. She also knew that putting her hands anywhere on her chest right now while closely looking at her son's thick erection made her tremble in a powerfully pleasurable way. Hard to believe this is a necessary medical procedure, isn't it? Akami asked somewhat amusedly to Susan as she stroked and stroked and stroked, trying to get Alan to come for the third time. If anyone could see me now, they might assume I'm a hot and horny cum-starved slut in some kind of three-way orgy. Let's hope Dr. Fredrickson doesn't decide to pop his head in. You might find that a bit embarrassing, for him to see you like that. Susan looked down at her fingers pulling on her nipples and wanted to crawl in a hole and die. But it felt too good to stop. She knew she'd never experienced an orgasm before that day, but she wasn't sure whether that was what was happening at the moment. She'd already felt several thrills race through her body, surges of pleasure that started near her clitoris and made her feel so euphoric that she was light-headed. But she felt something bigger coming on, something so big, intense, and powerful that she was almost afraid to experience it. Akami continued in her usual calm, clinical voice, "Next time, if we take more care, we'll be able to conclude our appointment quickly without any loss of clothes, except of course for Alan's. I really must apologize. I feel so embarrassed, doing my job in just my panties. I guess that's a consequence of being new at this and dealing with his unusual condition." All the while, her fingers continued to saw in and out of his butt and swirl around his shaft. "It's really quite all right," replied Susan in a shaky voice. "These things happen." Subconsciously she strongly suspected that all these sexual things happening weren't just coincidence, but she didn't let herself ponder the issue or wonder about Akami's motives. Not thinking about it meant that she didn't have to analyze her own confused feelings. Plus, she was too busy playing with her big melons to really think about anything else at that moment. "I think I'll need to perform these breast checks quite often," she thought as she continued to pull at her nipples. "I'm at that age where cancer becomes a real concern." What did she say? It's best to be very careful, and it's impossible to do it too much. I wonder if once or twice a day is a good amount. Since it's not actually sexual but just a medical procedure, then it must be okay. Right. True, it does seem a little bit sexual, but she says I have to do this for my health. Now, continued Akami, trying to gain Susan's attention, once again your son is getting close to ejaculation. But it would be better if we could prolong the stimulation a bit more before achieving that end, so this can count as one of his 6 times today. She continued to saw with her hands. After a while, she said to no one in particular, I must admit my hands are getting tired. Perhaps if I switch. She pulled her hand away from his throbbing dick. Susan, could you lubricate this other finger please? What? Huh? Oh. With what? The smell of Alan's semen filling the room clouded Susan's brain as if she were deep in a fog bank, hopelessly lost. She could barely hear or process Akami's words, they sounded like they were coming from rooms away. That towel on the chair there. Susan turned around, reached out and picked up the towel. She noticed that it was the one she and Akami had used to wipe off some of Alan's cum. There was cum all over it. Oh dear. She wants me to rub Tiger's cum all over her finger so she can stick it up his anus. That's so very improper. What is she thinking? Is that some kind of medical procedure? Well, she is the nurse. As the other two were occupied and facing the other direction, Susan again furtively took a taste of her son's seed from a big gob on the towel. She sucked that finger dry, even as she unconsciously moved it in and out of her mouth as if she were sucking the cum directly from his hard penis. With her other hand, she continued to fondle a bare breast. Oh no. What am I doing? I can't stop myself. But this is so good. She hungrily ate another gob. Goodness. So improper. But it tastes too yummy. Akami secretly smiled to herself. She didn't need more lubrication, and if she did want some, Alan's hard on was continuously oozing pre.cum. But she'd figured it would be one more thing to get Susan even more excited, and by the length of time it took Susan to return with the towel, she knew she'd been right. In fact, the only reason Susan gave the towel back at all and didn't just lick the towel completely clean was because a vague voice somewhere in the far reaches of her brain reminded her that Akami was expecting her to do something. Finally, Akami plunged her finger into a big puddle of cum on the towel as Susan held it, and it came out covered in the stuff. Excellent. This will provide the lubrication I need. She took one finger out of his anus and immediately stuck the new finger in. She then rubbed his hard on with the other hand. Susan gasped yet again as she returned to her seat and began rubbing her naked chest more aggressively. She knew on some level that Alan was watching her and even openly gawking at her, but she didn't let herself think about that because she didn't want to feel obliged to make him stop. Many more minutes passed. Akami expertly kept him right on the verge of a great climax without letting him go over. After a while, she said, as long as we're doing this, let's multi-task. Susan, come closer. Come a lot closer. While you keep up your breast check, I want you to lean in over my shoulder to look at what my fingers are doing. Susan leaned in. Like this. Alan cried out loudly, like he'd just been stabbed. Susan pulled back and looked around with worry. What? What happened? Akami said, I think that he got extremely excited staring at your breasts. You know, when you lean forward like that, they make an especially enticing sight for a horny young man like your son. Oh. Susan put her hands over her erect nipples, causing tit-flesh to bulge out above and below her crossed arms. No, it's good, Akami said. Don't cover up. Remember, the goal is to keep his big dick throbbing with pleasure as long as we can, to stimulate his hormone production. Alan was so blissed out that he barely knew what was going on. He thought, correctly, that he had started to come when he saw Susan's big tits swaying over his crotch, but he didn't realize that Akami had squeezed the root of his shaft in a certain way to abort the ejaculation and pull him back. Since she was a nurse with knowledge of human anatomy, she knew little tricks like that. As Akami stroked, she said to Susan, okay, now come here closer. Susan uncrossed her arms again and leaned forward once more. Closer. Susan moved in until her face was only about a foot from Alan's cockhead, not to mention Akami's stroking fingers. Alan looked at his mother's dangling globes and decided it was just too exciting a sight to handle. He closed his eyes and kept them closed, hoping that would help him stave off his imminent ejaculation just a little longer. "Okay, see what I'm doing here?" Akami said to Susan. "I'm mostly rubbing this spot right here, on the underside of his penis just below the crown. Now, as a married woman, I'm sure that you're aware that this is by far the most sensitive part of a man's penis. So, naturally, most of my efforts are focused there. But what I bet you didn't know is that area has a name, and it's called the frenulum. Or, as I like to call it, the sweet spot." Susan shook her head. In truth, she had a vague idea that the head of the penis was the most sensitive area, but she'd never had any sex education, and she and her husband Ron never spoke of such things. She'd literally been having sex with him only once or twice a year, and that was in the dark, in the missionary position, with almost no foreplay. She hardly even knew what Ron's penis looked like in detail, and about the only time she'd touched it was by necessity to help guide it into her vagina. Akami continued, "See. I keep rubbing that spot, right there. His sweet spot. But I vary it up. It's more arousing if you continually surprise him. See how I rub it this way, and then I switch it up and do it like this. And just once he starts to get used to that, I slide my fingers down a couple of inches, and back up again. Here, come closer and have a better look." Susan moved in until her nose was practically bumping against the side of his shaft. She was transfixed by the sexy sight. She noted, "It's all wet. Your fingers are wet too." Akami looked at Susan as if she were surprised. "Surely, as a married woman, you know that's pre-cum, right? It's not the same as cum, but it helps me do things like this." She suddenly slid her fingers all the way down to the base of his shaft, and then stroked her way all the way back up to the head. For some reason, that was just about the most arousing sight Susan had ever seen, maybe because it reminded her of just how long and thick her son's erection truly was. She felt that she was about to pass out. She sensed she was extremely close to coming, but she fought it off with great effort for fear of the things she might scream out and the noise she would make. At the same time, she backed off and sat down on her chair, looking in on the action over Akami's shoulder. Seeing that both Susan and Alan seemed to like that a lot, Akami kept repeating the move, varying it up sometimes with corkscrew motions. Alan grunted in agony and ecstasy with every long stroke Akami gave his erection. He was very close to orgasm, and would have come long ago except that Akami knew just how to manipulate him to prolong his pleasure. Plus, there was that squeezing trick she'd used that gave him a second wind of sorts. Akami was having a grand time. She particularly loved the way that Susan was so breathless that she kept unwittingly panting, so that her moist, hot breath blew against the most sensitive parts of Alan's boner. She continued to offer pointers to Susan, such as, "Now, you'll note that I'm using 2 hands to stroke his dick right now. That's because stimulating his prostate with my finger in his anus is too arousing, so I had to stop. After all, our goal isn't just to make him come, it's to maximize and prolong his stimulation. There's such a thing as being too effective. I'll probably save that move for later, for right when he's about to blow his load." Susan again unconsciously stuck 2 fingers back in her mouth and thrust them in and out, imagining they were the stiff boner right in front of her. It seemed so real to her addled brain that she thought to herself, "Oh no. Tiger's big erection is in my mouth. He's filling it up with his hot, hot meat and his naughty mommy is taking it all in. So this is what a blowjob is. It's so good." Drool dripped from her saliva-covered fingers and down her chin. However, Susan soon had to pull her fingers away because she was struggling to get enough air to breathe, and she felt embarrassed by what Akami must think of her. Akami coughed a number of times until she caught Susan's attention and Susan was able to get her panting under control, although her huge bare boobs kept heaving up and down. Then Akami said, "I think we're just about ready now." Susan, would you position the sample cup for me? I'm counting on you to hold it over the end of his penis and catch as much of the ejaculate as you can. Susan grabbed the sample cup from the stand beside them, very disappointed that this probably meant the end of her breast exam, and especially the end of watching Akami's expert handjob. Akami then turned her attention to the happy patient. Alan, open your eyes and look at me. He did look at her, or at least he tried to. He couldn't help but notice Susan sitting beside and slightly behind Akami with a slack-jawed stare focused on his thick rod, as if she were possessed or struck dumb. Her enormous tits were heaving like she'd just run a marathon, and so were Akami's. Between the two of them sitting there bare-chested, Alan thought to himself, Lord, if you're going to take me young, do it now, because I'm in heaven already. Akami stared him straight in the eyes with a sultry look and said, I want to take my tongue and lick your cock all over. I'm going to put your cock in my mouth and suck it dry. Oh my God, he cried out. His balls tightened up and his erection began to buck. Susan rushed to position the cup. She was delirious with anticipation, overjoyed to see his cum gush forth. Her hands were shaking. In the last seconds before Akami knew he would start to come, she came up with an idea to further sexually corrupt Susan. She snatched the cup from her with both hands. Here, I have to hold that. You hold his penis so his aim is true. What? Excuse me. Susan thought her heart would thump right out of her chest. Akami yelled, quick. There's no time. Without thinking, Susan grabbed her son's erection. It was the first time she'd touched his penis directly since he was a toddler. She didn't want to do it, even with her great arousal, but she feared his cum would fly off in every direction if she didn't, and she was trained to follow instructions given by people in an official capacity. Susan gasped in amazement, stunned at its heat, its unusual thickness, and how it seemed to be throbbing with life. But she didn't have more than a second or two to think about that, because he began shooting ropes of cum into the cup. Her hands were shaking, inadvertently increasing Alan's pleasure, but she made sure to hold his boner in position so that not a drop was spilled. She was so turned on and excited that it was a near thing she didn't faint. Susan's eyes were as wide as saucers as she watched rope after rope of hot cum blast into the cup. In actual fact, the amount of ejaculate was normal for a man, which meant it wouldn't even fill a shot glass. But to Susan's inexperienced and excited mind, it seemed like he was in danger of filling the entire cup that Akami was holding. Akami climaxed at the same time as Alan, but the other two were so busy they didn't realize this. In fact, the whole building could have caved in at that moment and they wouldn't have realized it. Not that many seconds later, Alan's ejaculation petered out. Akami had to move the cup still closer to the tip of his dick to catch the last couple of weak spurts. But that gave her another idea. She shouted urgently, Susan, stroke it. He's running out. We've got to catch all the cum we can. Susan couldn't believe it. Stroke it. You heard me. Hurry. Susan was so aroused that she thought she would truly lose her mind. She deferred to authority again and started to tentatively stroke. Her son's shaft was wet from pre-cum, so her fingers slid back and forth with surprising ease. Even though Alan had just climaxed, his dick remained stiff. Knowing that his mother was effectively giving him a handjob helped make sure he stayed that way for at least a little longer. He even shot out a couple more weak spurts, providing seeming justification for Akami's instruction to stroke it, after all. However, Susan was so embarrassed and shy about what she was doing that her fingers didn't move that much. The mere fact that she was touching his dick at all was extremely arousing, much more so than the actual tactile sensations she was causing. In fact, her fingers soon came to a standstill after she saw no more cum was going to dribble out. She didn't want Akami or Alan to think she was eager to do this. She asked the nurse, is it okay if I let go? I think it's, done. Akami could see that Alan's erection was starting to subside. She didn't see much point in pushing Susan any further. She knew that what had already occurred was a very big step, so she said, "Yes, you can. Thanks for the help there. Sorry about putting you on the spot like that. I didn't think ahead." "That's quite all right," Susan said politely as she finally let go. "These things happen, I guess." But while she tried to appear relatively normal, except for her blushing face, her mind was racing and her heart was too. "These things happen. No, they don't. I just touched my son's member. I even massaged it a little bit. That's terribly, terribly improper. How on earth?" "I'm in shock." With his penis completely flaccid again, Alan just closed his eyes and rested. He was actually afraid to look at his mother's continually heaving and jiggling chest for fear of getting erect yet again. Furthermore, he refused to think about the fact that she'd held his erection and even jacked him off a little bit. It was simply too much excitement to take. Chapter 40 Susan's First Orgasm. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The three of them were quiet for a minute or two while everyone calmed down. No one moved or made any attempt to put on clothes. Despite the lack of activity, Susan's face remained cherry red and she kept her eyes averted. She actually said a mental prayer. "Dear Lord, please forgive me. That must be some sort of sin, I'm sure. I didn't intend to touch him there, really, but the nurse kind of made me. It all happened so fast. Please, please, forgive me." Alan was stunned beyond belief. "Holy shit. Mom just held and even stroked my dick. I can't believe it. I know it happened because I sure as hell felt it, but I still can't believe it. Mom. My super prudish mom. Man, these appointments are awesome." Akami finally broke the silence with a matter-of-fact sounding voice. "You see," she said to Susan, "a little dirty talk at the right moment is an excellent way to push him over the edge, if other methods aren't enough. And now that you help stimulate him with your hands, you don't have to be shy about doing that in the future. But if that isn't enough, you may want to help him with your tongue as well." "I see," said Susan, but what she was really seeing in her mind was the more literal meaning of helping him with her tongue. "Oh dear. Oh my goodness. Does she really expect me to do that again? That can't be. I'm a respectable, God-fearing mother. I'm his mother, for crying out loud. Why does she seem to forget that? And what's this talk about using one's tongue? That's insanity. I can't imagine how good it would feel to lick it too. Wait, good. I meant, weird. Weird and wrong. Sinful. But what if Nurse Akami asks me to lick his, member, right now? Would I have to do it? Maybe I should. She is the nurse, and she knows best. She keeps helping him with her hand, but never with her mouth. Maybe he needs me to give him a blowjob right now." She pinched her nipples and accidentally moaned out loud in excitement. She was the only one who hadn't truly climaxed yet, and her sexual anticipation seemed to only grow even as the others calmed down and her own breathing returned to normal. But now that she had retreated somewhat from her erotic peak, she felt nearly as guilty and conflicted as she was horny. Yet, strangely, remembering the sinfulness of what she was doing actually served as a kind of aphrodisiac, causing her arousal to come surging back. "How does that feel, Alan?" asked the nurse. "Sore." "Yes, sore, very sore." "Arg," he groaned. Not only did his penis hurt, but his anus still felt strange as well. Despite that, he didn't have any complaints. It had been a great experience, even better than watching internet porn with Suzanne. He knew he certainly would never forget the moment his mother wrapped her fingers around his shaft and started to stroke. Akami began the slow process of ending the appointment. "Very good, Alan. And thanks for your assistance, Susan. Alan, when you're ready, please change back into your clothes." The nurse turned to Susan and began lecturing her while both remained topless. So, as you can see, I think the important point made here today is that, in Alan's case, it's important to treat the stimulation of the penis and the achievement of ejaculation as a routine procedure. One that should be done 6 times a day, and should be treated as just another thing to do, like brushing one's teeth. If one can eliminate the emotional baggage and preconceived notions, it will be that much easier to get things done. The important thing is to act maturely and professionally on a daily basis. Susan just nodded dumbly in reply. She was only able to focus on a few words, because she was still in a state of shock from what had just happened. Ejaculation. Of his penis. Need stimulation. My hands. My hands around his penis. Professional. I have to do it professionally. Daily. Do it daily. Akami still sat there in her chair. She was afraid to get up, because that would expose the large puddle of cum that had dripped from her panties into the seat of her chair, and that would make a mockery of her speech on professionalism. Susan, could you do me one more favor? She asked. I'd be rather embarrassed in this condition to have the doctor come in now with my other uniform. Could you go outside and get it? No problem, Susan said. Her pussy was also dripping wet, very wet. Luckily she was wearing a thick, dark skirt so her wet spots weren't so obvious. She figured, I can make a quick getaway to the bathroom and get myself cleaned up. I can't let Tiger see me like this. He might get the wrong idea. He might think I got excited looking at him, and even touching him, and that's not true. I'll just clean myself up a bit, and that's all. Masturbation is wrong. Akami explained, that's a deer. Just go outside, turn left, and open the first door on your right. In there you'll see a black bag sitting on a shelf. Just grab the whole bag and bring it back here. Oh, and you'll probably want to dress first. Susan hastily put on her bra and blouse. Then she rushed the short distance to the bathroom. Susan took a long time, much more than 5 minutes. Alan and Akami meanwhile made small talk, trying their best to ignore the fact that Alan was dressed in a hospital gown that concealed nothing and that Akami was still sitting in nothing but a completely soaked pair of tiny panties. Alan wanted to use a towel to clean up before changing, but Akami seemed determined not to move, and he was afraid to ask her or to get up himself. Alan finally was able to have a good long look at the nearly naked nurse, now that his mother wasn't around to preempt his attention. Akami didn't seem to mind at all, and just smiled happily at him while they talked. She thrust her chest out proudly, but hid her groin by crossing her legs. She'd also had enough for one session and didn't want to get him too aroused again. Feeling mischievous, Akami said, there are a few things I want to mention before you go, one of which I want to talk to you about before your mother gets back. She paused to organize her thoughts, then said, I can tell you eat a lot of fruit, specifically acidic types. Am I right? Puzzled and surprised, he asked, how did you know? She licked her lips seductively and replied, certain foods will affect the taste of a man's ejaculate. When you had your accident earlier you got a little bit in my mouth. She was surprised she could say that with a straight face, since she had tasted far more than what he had inadvertently shot into her mouth. He was shocked and mortified, yet somehow also aroused. The nurse continued, in this case, you taste sweet, almost sugary. I can tell that you've been avoiding that list of cruciferous foods that I gave you during your last visit. Those foods will also affect your taste, but in a bad way. She continued to explain the pros and cons of different foods, including ones that would increase his libido. She thought, I should tell Susan about such foods as well, but I'm not sure if she's ready to hear about them, and their implications, just yet. But then again, do I even need to explain the why of it? A while later, she said, I wonder what's taking your mother so long. He shrugged. He was puzzled too, because Susan was taking an unusually long time just to go to the bathroom. Susan, meanwhile, locked the door to the bathroom and immediately fell to the tile floor. She nearly tore her blouse open even as she pulled her skirt up around her waist. Within seconds, the idea of cleaning up her leakage morphed into frantic masturbation. She furiously got herself off, plunging 2 fingers deep into her slit. She simply never masturbated, but there was no way she could stop from doing it this time. She panted heavily. I've never felt so aroused in my entire life. This has nothing to do with Alan. This has nothing to do with Alan. I'm not even thinking about his huge penis. No, I'm not. The way I touched it. So hot. Oh, his big dick. I refuse to think about what it would be like to jack him off from start to finish. Dear Lord, that would be a thrill. But I'm not going to think about that. Or Akami's crazy talk about licking it. Or. What if he thrust it into my mouth? Oh God. I really can't let myself think about that. Or, God forbid, what if he speared me with it? Pounding into me, into my special place. My son's huge, hot penis. No. No. I'm driving that thought out of my mind. It must be. It must be the breast check. That explains it. Akami's hands. That got me too worked up. Must. Not. Think. Of. The. Penis. The thick, throbbing, penis. God. I want it. I want him. My son. My handsome, hunky son. She started orgasming over and over, and came what seemed like rivers and rivers of cum. When it was all over, she lay there panting for several more minutes. So that's what an orgasm is like. Wow. That was very, I don't even want to think about it. I wonder why I never had one with Ron and his tiny penis. I don't know if that was my first one ever, 'cause I had some pretty intense tingles earlier, but that was my first big one ever, for sure. Her joyous mood dissolved into one of defeat and weariness. I can't believe I just did that. It's so wrong. So very improper. What would my parents think of me now, if they could see me? They told me I'd burn in hell if I did that even once, and now I have. But not masturbating can't be right either, can it? Doesn't almost everyone masturbate? I'll bet you they masturbated, too. Look at my tiger. He has to masturbate 6 times a day. It's a medical necessity. So how can it be a sin? Still, it's different for women. After thinking it over some more, she decided that masturbating once was an excusable mistake that she could never let happen again. Suddenly realizing how much time had elapsed, she wiped off her legs, tried her best to tidy up, and went to look for Akami's bag. She wished dearly that she could have stayed in that bathroom a lot longer, not thinking about Alan's penis, not thinking how it felt in her hands, and most importantly, not thinking about how it would feel if he used it to deeply impale her pussy. So sorry, she said breathlessly to Akami when she finally returned and closed the door behind her. I had to go to the bathroom first, and then I got all disoriented coming from the other direction, and was afraid to open the wrong door. She'd felt calm and restrained when she re-entered the room, but then was assaulted by the pungent smells of Alan's cum and wet pussy that completely filled the room. Suddenly her erotic feelings came flooding back. Her knees got weak and she nearly collapsed on the floor. She desperately wanted to leave the room immediately, before she succumbed to her lustful need all over again. The nurse said, "No problem." She could make a very good guess why it had taken Susan so long to use the bathroom, but she saw no need to embarrass her further by even hinting at that reason. Instead she said, "Would you hand us some towels?" Akami thought, now if that didn't freak Susan out, I don't know what would. Maybe I did push things too far, but I got more than a little carried away myself. I'll bet dollars to donuts that Alan will come alone next time, which means I'll get to play with him without any restrictions. Whether she comes back or not, I win either way. And Suzanne strongly hinted she wanted me to help Susan open up sexually. Boy, did I do that, and in spades. We were just talking about some changes to Alan's diet. Do you cook his meals? Susan replied with more than a hint of pride, I do. All of them except what he eats at school. Then you need to increase his iodized salt intake. Iodine is essential for thyroid hormone production, and his iodine levels are lower than normal. Iodine isn't found in most foods, and he tells me that you don't add any salt to the food you cook. A little bit of iodized table salt sprinkled on his food at dinner should satisfy his needs. Another thought occurred to Akami, it would probably be a good idea to just add it to the food as you cook it instead. You and your daughter could probably benefit as well if you don't normally cook with it. Okay. That's easy enough to do, Susan replied. Seeing that Susan was accepting her suggestions without question, Akami proceeded to tell Susan about foods that would improve the taste of Alan's cum. She didn't give any reason, so Susan assumed that those foods also had something to do with increasing his thyroid hormone production. Just as they seemed to be wrapping up, Akami asked Alan, so, now that a little time has elapsed, how does your penis feel? If you remember, when I asked you if your penis was sore after your last orgasm, your answer was, and I quote, yes, sore, very sore. Arg. That's not good. He winced. Now that he'd calmed down a lot, it was embarrassing to talk about such things. However, he truthfully admitted, it does still feel strange. Akami furrowed her brow. That has me concerned. I suppose the best thing to do is to keep an eye on the situation. Susan, I don't normally do this, but since this is a special case, I'll make an unusual exception. I'll call you this evening and you can give me an update on his condition. If he's still feeling sore, we may have to take additional measures, such as scheduling another appointment, possibly as soon as tomorrow. Susan nodded grimly. She was easily led to worry about the health of her children. Alan and Susan left the doctor's office a short time later, with Susan practically dragging him out the door. Both had the feeling that something really important had happened there, that some Rubicon had been crossed, but neither of them were quite sure what it was or wanted to think about it much. They were just plain exhausted and eager to get home.